I'm always so bad at starting these. Hope you guys appreciate my really questionable attempt at set design here. We got going on here. It's kind of a mess. So today's, I guess, was the Let's Talk About series, I guess, whatever the fuck that means. It's just we just talk about things. It's just a media discussion podcast thing. This one's not going to have Stephanie in it, because I don't think Stephanie has shown any interest so far in actually watching The Witcher. So this is just on me this time around. And I don't know, I kind of want to discuss this in part because I seem to have an unpopular opinion regarding this particular property. Because everyone seems to love this. Just every podcast I listen to, every random person that brings it up, everyone's recommending the show constantly to everybody, and it's so positive. And that is not quite my experience. I'm not here to tear the whole thing down and hate on it and all that, but I do have a lot of issues with the show, and I figure it might be interesting and kind of fun to get into those details and discuss some of that stuff, just because it seems to be the outsider opinion, and so maybe this will be interesting to people. But if you just want it, if you just want somebody to tell you how great the show is or whatever, maybe just don't watch this. I'm not here to harsh your yums and all that, but I found watching the show increasingly frustrating as it went on. Like the first episode I really liked, I think, and then as I went forward through the show, I kind of just kept turning on it more and more. I should open up Netflix so I can actually see the episode to episode thing a little bit. This isn't really that important though, but yeah. So where to start? I think I'm gonna try to avoid spoilers as long as possible. Then I'll have a spoiler warning eventually, I guess. Also, this set is very distracting. I'm gonna have to move this junk out of the way before long. This is a stupid idea. But I think that The Witcher is plagued by more structural problems and premise problems and adaptation problems that I can talk about in a non-spoilery way. But, you know, everyone has different definitions of spoilers. I'm gonna try not to explicitly spoil anything for a while here, but people have very different thresholds for what they consider to be a spoiler. But if you're watching media about a thing that you want to go in without spoilers completely, then I'm questioning your methodology by watching the thing in the first place that is about the thing that you don't want us to have spoilers on. But overall, I think if you want a recommendation, most people are probably going to like the show that are the kind of person that would want to watch a show about the Witcher. I would say I still recommend reading the books, because this is an adaptation of the books, which is different from the games. Because the Witcher games are sequels to the books that I think at one point were considered canon, but now aren't considered canon. But really, that's not really the most important concept in the world necessarily. But these are actually like one-to-one adaptations of the books, and that's where we get into trouble. Especially since I've read the books, and it's like, this video is going to be kind of one of those classic situations of like, person has read books, says books are better than media, and here's why, but in like long form and all that. At the same time though, I think there's reasons to point out why it's better or worse in certain ways that like go beyond just the fact that it's a book adaptation and like, it's not the same as it was in the book, therefore it's bad. Like I'm not minimizing it down to that degree. It's more, there are things the book does really well, I think, that the show does not do well, which is kind of a problem, because if you're going to adapt the stories but just do them worse, that's kind of a bummer, right? Like, it's not a matter of like, oh, they went somewhere else with it and it's cool in its own way. A lot of these stories that are adapted are just straight up lesser and worse, and a lot of them are based on larger decisions that were made from day one about how the entire thing was going to be structured and what they were going to do with this, and that's kind of what the issue is. So let's get started on that. So first of all, The Witcher does something, Netflix show does something fundamentally different than the books do. I guess I should do my my credentials here, huh? So there's a giant stack of books in front of me. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 books in front of me, 4 graphic novels, and these are just my Gwent decks that I got with the Witcher 3 DLCs that I went and got them because they were limited things, I guess. making, I guess it makes those collector's edition items, except they weren't a pre-order bonus necessarily. It was like a code you could redeem to gain the ability to buy something on a store, which is hard to explain, but I like The Witcher. This is one of only 3 collector's editions I've bought in my entire life. The other 2 being Halo 2 and Mass Effect 1. It's like those 2 games and Witcher 3, if you count these 2 Gwent decks as being DLC special editions, which I guess they kind of are. They're like physical special edition add-ons to digital content for Witcher 3, which the original game I didn't even pay for because I got a code from CD Projekt Red directly, which was neat because I only had like 1,000 subscribers at the time and they gave me a code. I'm like, all right, casting a wide net here, are we? But as out of all this stuff here, I've read all 4 of these graphic novels or these comics collections or whatever, but out of the books, I've only read The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny. Everything else, I want to get to it. I got it all in one giant pile. It's kind of a Christmas present like 2 or 3 years ago because somebody was like, what do you want? And I'm like, I'm always really bad at asking for anything. So I was like, I don't know. I kind of want to read the Witcher books. And then they just showed up with like this giant stack of red books. I'm like, oh, cool. and they're good. But conveniently, the 2 books we're talking about today are The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, because this entire season of Witcher was based entirely on those 2 books. So conveniently, I've read the exact 2 books that this season was about, and none of the other ones. So I can't spoil the future of the books for you. All I could potentially spoil for you about the future of the show, or whatever, is if they ever cover anything from the games, then there's like stuff I could reference there, but I don't really plan on it. But yeah, those 2 books conveniently are the only ones I've read. Let's move this stuff out of the way. All right, we've thrown away the pretense of that stupid set that I had, or whatever the fuck that was. So all that's on my desk is now the 2 books we're actually talking about. There's probably going to be some jump cuts in this video because I'm probably going to be referencing Wikipedia pages here and there, just because it's not because I necessarily need just to discuss these concepts, but because, like, you know, if the information's readily available, it's worth kind of reviewing stuff here and there. Just might as well not be talking completely out of my ass because I only did 1 pass. I've played the game once, I've read the books once, and I've watched the show once, so memory faulty and all that. But thankfully, the wiki page for this season actually explains what stories each episode was adapted from, and so I can review those on the fly, because there's also a full wiki page summarizing every individual story. But yeah, my takeaway though is check these books out. It's worth doing, I think, in part because you might be like used to really dry fantasy novels and being like bored and tired, and you read your Tolkien and you read your George R. R. Martin, and you just kind of all right, I'm kind of pushing through this because I'm sure there's gonna be a payoff for this. Like, the characters and the story are gonna be interesting in a way that like makes it worth it to give this thing the attention and that it requires to go through it. But you know, there's like a denseness to it. There's overwritten elements. There's a dense world, and like long descriptions of like banquets that people are having, and like I just remember a few times in George R. R. Martin's books, the Game of Thrones series, the Song of Ice and Fire series, that like there was parts where I just kept starting something over because I was like, I didn't take anything out of that. I'm sorry, I zoned out, because that was a very long description of like a setting or something, or a meal, and it just wasn't the moment-to-moment stuff. I found The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny to be very snappy books. They're a fun little wild time. They're well-paced. They're not like totally schlocky like those parodies of action stories that you read in video games, where they have like a parody of a spy thriller or a parody of an action hero that's like really schlocky and garbage. It's not like that, but it isn't the full... It doesn't have the kind of pretense that most fantasy writing tends to have. You really go right into it. It really feels like the author for these books prioritizes the actual story and characters above all else. So you pretty much go from 0 to 100 all the time, and you kind of just hop right into the characters doing things, and you kind of have to understand the world around them via context clues, or you know, when somebody comes and actually has like some kind of political debate is often when you actually start learning about the history of the world and so on, and that's often the function of some of these interactions. Instead of having like a long multi-page explanation of how the world works or anything like that, like from the first story, immediately Geralt is using like tinctures or potions or whatever they were called, that's the toxic witcher stuff, and he's using his signs, and he's not explaining them, he's just doing it, and all you get is at most you get like maybe the word that he says when he does the sign, and then the reaction of what the sign does, and you never get like a laydown of like, here's all the moves that the Witcher has and when they can use them and what their limitations are and like where he learned them in great detail over the course of years of training from this order, and that order has this like no, these are just a series of short stories that just go. Like I found it really interesting how like when I read The Last Wish right from chapter 1, it almost felt like I was reading a sequel, but it was the first one. Like the author seemed to just assume I understood his world and just went, instead of taking time to set up like, and here's who Geralt is as a character, and here's the location that they're currently in, and what that location means, and here's what a Witcher is, and all these other, like, no, you're gonna pick up over the course of the stories what a Witcher is, and what the geopolitics of the region are, and like how people treat the Witcher, and also what Geralt values as a person, and like how people think he doesn't have emotions, and he doesn't really necessarily explain that he does have emotions, but you can clearly intuit along the way that he actually isn't quite what people think he is in a number of ways. Like, it's all action. It's all things, and I don't mean action is like combat. I mean action is like things are just happening all the time in these books, so they're excellently paced. They're a great time to read, and in particular, it's kind of a stroke of genius. Like, I kind of wish I could get more introductions to fantasy settings like this, where instead of beginning the hero's journey via, the hero's journey trope, starting at episode 1 and like, here's a person living in a poor little village and they're really happy, but maybe they wish that they had more, or maybe they yearn for adventure, and then maybe like the orcs attack their village and like, oh no, I need to go out and strike out on an adventure, and then they come back changed at the end of the story. Like, we've all done the hero's journey 100 times by now, and if nothing else, just imagine Lord of the Rings and you have an idea. Both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are that idea, more or less. The Witcher just throws that away immediately. And you just do a bunch of stories around the world, and there's no requirement to connect them to each other, which is really useful. Like, if you're not concerned with having a structured narrative where everything has like an overall arc to it, and each event informs the other ones in a really direct way because it's actually like all leading up to one overall plot. Like, if you're not concerned with that, you can actually just kind of leap around the world and build your universe. Like, strangely, these two books, the Sword of Destiny and The Last Wish, are structured like a season of Doctor Who. Like, there's probably going to be like the big impactful episode of the season at some point that you kind of take away as being like kind of the point, or like the chapter that has the most long-term ramifications for the characters and the plot or something. But like, it's just a bunch of standalone stories, kind of. But all those standalone stories build up your idea of like what the overall story is and what the characters are. I think that's a pretty interesting idea. It's also rather refreshing to just like read for like 20 or 30 pages and then be like, and reset and just start a new story. But it's a new story featuring characters you've met before, so it's like you're still learning and progressing and learning about these people. It's just that like you're not reading one story for 400 pages. It's actually rather similar to like my recent readings. I've been reading like Neil Gaiman's adaptation of Norse mythology because of the God of War playthrough. And that was also like, it's just a series of short stories that are all individual things that all build up to an overall arc and idea, but it's not like every other show and movie and so on where there's like a continuity to it, and where it's all like these are all a series of actions that build up one plot. The problem is that they made a Netflix show about it. And a Netflix show, or a show in general, usually wants to have like a through line to it of like a sequence of events that all have an arc to it, and there's a building action that climaxes at a particular point in the season, and these are a sequence of actions these are a sequence of stories that happen in a chronological order that are all building up to the big finale kind of thing. And the problem is that they wanted to make that story by adapting these books. And these two books are both a series of short stories that are not really interested in doing that necessarily. So they have to change stuff, and they have to force stuff, and they also have to do some stuff about how television shows work versus how books work. That is something that I've picked up on that I'm pretty sure is a rule, but I don't know like 100% for sure if this is a rule or not. But we'll get to that. But just maybe check out the books. Also, if you want to hear about those comics, those 4 comics, they're all right. The art's good. Each one sounds like, each one feels like one of those side quests you do in Witcher 3, which is noteworthy because they're written by the people who wrote The Witcher 3, are the people who were involved in writing those books. Those comic books are like, I think they're all CD Projekt Red comic books. They're not, so they're part of the continuity of the games more so than the books, even though they're all kind of the same continuity-ish. But it's that writing style, which, depending on who you are, you might notice and you might not notice. But really, like, all throughout the games is always really good how, like, when you played various side stories, they would culminate in a, like, you'd get a relatively basic premise, and then you'd go investigate that premise, and your expectations would get subverted multiple times, and you kept encountering additional depth regarding like the person who sent you on the mission and the antagonist you're supposed to be hunting or dealing with, and half the time you end up siding with the person that you're supposed to be hunting in the first place because the person that sent you on the mission is lying to you. But also there's a bunch of like twists and turns about like the moral grayities of both people involved, and like and by the end you're not even sure if you made the right choice when you do make a choice, which is something that the show actually nails too. Like that kind of back and forth and development and those interesting stories that roll throughout Witcher 3, that's what those comics largely cover too, as they are more of those kinds of stories, and they're pretty all right. There's one thing I found weird. This isn't like, I'm not gonna make a big deal about this, even though it sounds like the kind of thing people make a big deal out of, but weird fixation on female villains and female monsters is just a trend I noticed. Like I was just, if you were on Discord while I was reading these, you saw me point it out, because I was like, there's a variety of different monsters in The Witcher. There's dragons, there's vampires, there's arachnid monsters, there's werewolves. But yeah, there's like a striga, and there's undead women and witches, and there's like bog hags or whatever they're called, and like there's, you know, a variety of distinctly female monsters in The Witcher, and specifically if I remember correctly, every single one of those comics had a female monster villain. I'm like, weird trend, but okay. And in particular, there's a dialogue line at some point where they were like talking about like doing one of those stereotypical conversations about how like women, man, you just can't understand them. Why, I'll take a monster any day. And it's like, I don't know. I feel slightly weird about the writer that's in charge of these, just because like that's a particular through line I kept latching onto, where I'm like, I'm not trying to think about this actively, but like, what's your deal, man? I'm starting to worry a little bit. But I still had a good time reading those books, and I want to buy more if they ever come out, but I don't know if they are, because they're putting out an omnibus, which I think might mean that they're done. That was just the run. Those 4 volumes might be the only ones that ever happened. I'm not sure. All right, so on to the structural problems of the Witcher show. So one, and this is kind of the big one, honestly. There's a thing that I've noticed about shows in general, which is that if you have the top billed cast, they pretty much always have to be in the show all the time. Like, your main characters are going to be in every episode. And that's kind of an issue for The Witcher, as you might imagine, if you read any of these books. And they really fixate on that. And it kind of became a problem for me. I've seen some iterations of this where it really stood out to me in other media, too. In particular, people who watch The Walking Dead. About 1 or 2 seasons ago, there was a season where they were ramping up for like this big war with Negan. And Michonne just doesn't do anything the entire season. Like, she kind of just goes back and forth between a couple of villages and like has an internal struggle a little bit, but doesn't do anything the entire season. She just does nothing at all. But she's in every single episode. Like, they keep spending more time on the internal strife of this character, and it's like, I get it, because she's like a main cast member. Like, she's one of the top billed people on The Walking Dead, and like she's like the most recognizable face that's been around for the longest time besides the other two characters that have been around for a while. It's like she's one of the 3 people the show fixates on these days. But they didn't come up with anything for her to do that season, so they just kept kind of showing her kind of feeling strife a bit. Like they kind of just kept showing Michonne feel angst and internal turmoil, and then she kind of said something at the end of the season that was kind of her like declaration a little bit, but like that was it for the whole season. And it's like you flew that actor out to Georgia to stand in the heat, and this is what you're doing with her, huh? I mean, I guess she gets paid, so whatever, but like watching the show, you're like, why are these segments here? These are a waste of time. And that's how I felt about The Witcher. So these books, and once again, I'm pointing out, didn't read those other 6 books yet. I would love to. In fact, the fact that this show is coming out, and I'm probably going to watch the future seasons as they come out, means that's probably going to light a fire under my ass to go watch those shows, read those books finally, and get caught up so I can stay ahead of the show. But so I'm just gonna be talking based on what I do know about the 1 game, 4 comics, 2 games, 4 comics, and 2 books that I've read so far. So if I say something wrong, sorry, about the larger world. But anyway, as far as I'm aware in The Witcher, this is a story told entirely through Geralt's perspective. That might become less true later, but as of now, the 2 books I've read are entirely Geralt's perspective. They follow him from place to place. You only encounter Yennefer and Ciri and Yarp and Zigrin and other characters and Dandelion from the perspective of Geralt when they intersect with his story. Triss, Renfri, and so on. And then they stick to that. They stick to that hard. But this show does not, which isn't necessarily a problem because it's a show. You can expand this out to a big, like Game of Thrones style thing of a bunch of parallel plots happening all at once and all that. But then we have a second problem, which is that for most of the season, these characters do not meaningfully interact. And more importantly, their timelines for what part of their narrative is interesting do not intersect. And so right from episode 1, you have Geralt's perspective for the majority of the episode, but then you keep cutting away to Ciri. And that's fine, but kind of an issue. But the first episode is great. But the second episode, you then introduce Yennefer. And then for the rest of the season, every single episode has Yennefer and Ciri and Geralt, even though they're not in the same location or doing the same story. And there's some parts of this I like and some parts that I don't like. In particular, I really don't like Ciri, just in general, in this show. It's not the actor's fault, and it's not necessarily... It really is just a structural thing, and some of the choices they made of what to do with Ciri. Because the problem is that when you're making a show that's an adaptation of a single perspective book, you have to make up everything else. So the stuff that is from Geralt's perspective is adaptations of these short stories, but the stuff from Yennefer and Ciri's perspectives are either adaptations of concepts that were introduced or things we kind of can infer about them based on the gaps of what you see from Geralt's perspective. Or in some cases, they just outright change things in really significant ways. And both of those are kind of iffy, but they're more successful with Yennefer than Ciri, I think. But I've got some mixed feelings about both. But in Ciri's case in particular, ultimately, she's just here to eventually meet Geralt. And so they show her, like, her origins a bit. And then she's in limbo for the entire season. She's in every episode for, like, let's say 10 minutes of the episode or something. I'm not going to sit here and, like, do charts of every episode where I'd figure out exactly what the breakdown is of Geralt versus Yennefer versus Ciri time. But generally speaking, you get a decent chunk of Ciri, but she's pretty much just going from place to place, kind of on the run, kind of exploring, kind of learning about the world as a sheltered, like, noble girl and all that. But she pretty much is just in limbo and just eating up the durations of episodes, which are pretty consistently almost exactly an hour long. And it starts to really hurt. Not just because the time spent with Ciri is not that well spent and the stories that she has aren't that interesting, but also because you start having these really increasingly abridged storylines with Geralt, where you start seeing all these issues where elements are just kind of being skipped over, and it's hard not to blame the overemphasis on Yennefer and Ciri on why the story they're actually adapting is getting so cut down. Because you would think that each of these books, like the goal is to, I mean, each of these episodes, the goal is to adapt this short story from this book. Because each of them is specifically like episodic in nature, where each episode Geralt is doing this story from The Last Wish, then he's doing this story from The Last Wish, and like they're very segmented off, where once you switch to the next episode, you're done with that previous short story. It's time for the next short story from The Last Wish, or eventually Sword of Destiny. And so when they run out of time, essentially, to do the story correctly because of these other elements, you can't help but think like maybe this whole idea was a mistake. But there are some elements I like. One in particular is they do something really clever, which is that they, how do I put this? It's like I like that they respect their audience enough to understand that these three storylines are not happening concurrently. Because you would think that if you're, you know, generally speaking, if you're cutting between multiple perspectives over time, you are generally trained by TV and movies and so on to think that that means that they're happening simultaneously. That's usually what it means when you cut back and forth between multiple stories, is that they're kind of happening approximately at the same time, and that's why you're showing them together. But and I think that might be what they want you to think, kind of, in the first episode. But then before long, you start having Yennefer's storyline say stuff like, "And then I spent 30 years like this," and it's like, oh, it's been decades since we last saw you, even though it's just the next episode. But Ciri is still the same age in this episode. So you start realizing these storylines are out of sync with each other. And in particular, you start seeing characters who die in one storyline but are alive in a later episode of another storyline. And then you start like really putting it together like, okay, these are storylines that are not happening at the same time. They're both not happening at the same time and not happening at the same rate. Like some of these stories, in particular, I think Ciri's story might happen over the course of like a week maybe, whereas Geralt's story might happen over the course of like 10 years, and Ciri and Yennefer's story might happen over the course of like 40 years. Like there's a gap. Like a lot of time passes in Yennefer's story. Geralt's story maybe less so, because Dandelion, which is named Jaskier in this game, doesn't especially seem like he's aging, whereas like Yennefer and Geralt, it's hard to say how much they even do visibly age, but Dandelion doesn't seem to be particularly aging, so I get the feeling that like his storylines are maybe over the course of a decade, whereas Ciri is a small girl, and every story, she's the only one that actually is structured like a normal show. Like Geralt and Yennefer still keep jumping forward in time from place to place, and you don't really have a lot of explanation for like why they're here now as opposed to where they were before. And it's like they're just doing continued journeys over the course of great spans of time, like, you know, because it's based on a bunch of short stories. But Ciri, episode to episode, picks up exactly where she left off, and you have a very like you could take all the Ciri storylines and string them together as one episode, which maybe they should have done, and that would have probably worked. That would probably be a coherent storyline with a beginning, a middle, and an end and everything. And it would function like it was one movie or show or episode or whatever. And that's like the fundamental difference between the different characters to some extent. So like that starts to really plague things. But in particular, there's I would say that of this season, I would say there's 2, maybe 3 good episodes, 2 frustrating episodes that might be bad. I'm mixed on them. And then 1 episode that's just genuinely awful. And then I guess there must be 2 episodes that are kind of unremarkable, or I'm not thinking about them that much, because it is an 8-episode season, and three episodes come to mind as being really good. 3 episodes come to mind as being particularly not good. 2 being frustrated and conflicting for me, and 1 being like, this was a giant waste of time. Why does this episode exist? Why did you do this to me? So mixed bag. If you're up for a mixed bag show, maybe check it out anyway. It's available right now on Netflix. It's all out. You can watch it right now if you want to see it. I'm trying to think if there's much more I want to talk about. The set design and the effects are all fine. The actors are all giving it a good attempt. Like, it's just, the setting's enjoyable and it's cool. There's some really cool creature designs that are kind of fun to see, even though they're very brief on with their screen presence, because CGI budgets and all that. A lot of it is CG, so, and a lot of it's noticeably CG. So like a lot of them look a little weird, a little out of place, and like the camera gets a little too suddenly fixed in its place because they need to make the CG look better, and it looks better if the camera doesn't move. And I have a few mixed feelings about the creatures, but you know, it's never necessarily been the focus of the story of The Witcher, as much as you might think it is, because he's called The Witcher and he's a monster hunter and all that. It's often about the narrative of each individual episode and scenario and how that thing plays out. So in those situations, like, it's often about like the person who's betraying Geralt, or who's using Geralt for their own benefit and so on, and what the motivations are behind this monster killing. And also like a lot of situations where you're like, oh, this monster's sentient, I'm not going to kill that, and stuff like that. Like, that's often what's more interesting than the actual battles, which a couple of times the show is the problem, is that there's a couple of times where the show kind of just gives up on that and just has a battle, and that's disappointing. But yeah, I think it's the basics. Sorry, I probably haven't had the most coherent final thought necessarily, but it's because I'm trying to give pre-spoiler thoughts before I just go into the actual meat of what I took issue with. But that's my basic idea, is that it's a competent fantasy adventure action, like dark fantasy humorous kind of thing, and some of the characters are well done, and some of it's well done but has major structural problems, and I can't get into the details of that without giving in to the actual spoilers. So I'm going to start those now. Spoilers for the rest of this video. I'm going to start actually discussing the individual things I took issue with in a more detailed manner, and so on. So let's get that started. So come back after you've watched the show, or just keep pushing forward if you don't care, or if you've read the books and already know the story that they're adapting and just want to hear how they fucked it up, because that's kind of how I feel about it. So first off, we have The End's Beginning. This is episode 1 of the show. This is an adaptation of the story The Lesser Evil from The Last Wish. Right off the bat, book readers are probably going to be thinking, oh, The Lesser Evil? Not the voice of reason? Okay, sure, why not? Because you open up the book, it opens up with the story The Voice of Reason, but sure, we could start with The Lesser Evil, I guess. They're a bunch of short stories. Sure. So we're starting with the 4th story out of 7 in a 7-story long book. Sure. It's actually a pretty good choice, I think. Lesser Evil is a pretty good opening note if you want to establish this idea of moral grayness and the idea of not necessarily knowing like what the right choice is in a given situation, because it's the story where you meet this woman Renfrey who she's one of many women who were part of a prophecy that's supposed to end the world, essentially. And so they've all been systematically hunted down one by one and killed. And because these people thought that they were going to stop the apocalypse, essentially, if they hunted down and murdered all these people. And the person who tells Geralt this is this wizard in the tower, but he seems really scummy. He's got this like garden full of naked women that are all tending his garden. They might be illusions or they might be real, I don't remember. And he seems to be up to not necessarily the best things, and is generally revealed to be kind of conniving throughout the season anyway. But at the same time, you get this reason for like why people wanted to kill all these women was because like, they were all part of this prophecy about how the world was going to end. But Renfrey's the single survivor, and she reveals like she's had to do this entire life of being this monster that's on the run for reasons that are out of her control, which directly parallels Geralt himself, because he is a person who became this monster, a witcher, outside of his own will as a child, and has had to deal with being an outcast from society his entire life as a result of that. So like those two have a lot in common in that way. So it's a good intro story to The Witcher for that reason. What unfortunately what's revealed is that So what happens is Geralt explains his internal strife, and sort of like his way of dealing with this is like he's just kind of become accustomed to the idea he's always going to be an outsider, and he doesn't really have a home, he doesn't have a people to call his own, and he's not going to belong in society. And so, and he kind of has defanged the power of it by owning that to some extent. To some extent, it's the equivalent of like the old dwarfs or bastards speech that Tyrion gives at the beginning of Game of Thrones. That's kind of what Geralt's stance is on being a witcher, and tries to tell Renfri this as some sort of ill comfort for what she has to live with. But she can't simply move on. She has to take her revenge. And so she is going to go right back into town, and she's going to kill that wizard, and she's going to kill anyone who gets in her way. And she might just start killing people in general just to flush him out. And so now Geralt's stuck in this problem where he doesn't want to do the wizard's mission to kill Renfri because she's been wronged and isn't really in the wrong, but she's now going to do this. So Geralt's going to end up having to kill Renfri to stop her from doing what he couldn't talk her out of doing, because that's crossing a line. But then even after he kills Renfri, he still won't let the wizard go anywhere near her body, and like is defending Renfri's corpse that he created because he's the one who killed her. He's defending Renfri's corpse from the wizard because he wants to use it. He almost certainly wants to use it for experiments, or to learn things about the curse or the prophecy and so on. And for Geralt, that's also crossing a line. Like you have a character with a particular moral code dealing with people that have their own motivations, and everyone's kind of in the wrong for a variety of reasons, while also kind of having motivations that kind of make them right in certain ways. And Geralt had to make a call, and his call was to save the village from this woman, even though he didn't want this woman to die. And so he's still conflicted all the way down to the last minute, and there's a lot of details there. It's all really good. There's one specific thing that really bugs me, though, which is that as Renfri is dying, she just kind of exposits a prophecy at Geralt about destiny. And she specifically says, like, the girl in the woods is your destiny and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, we're doing this, huh? Why not, I guess? But I'm not a big fan of prophecies in general, so that stuff's always kind of awkward. But like in this particular case, it was so awkward to have like a prophecy about unrelated characters while this other character is dying. It almost feels like it diminishes her significance, that she's like here to explain this other prophecy that has nothing to do with her in any way. And on some level, I think they're trying to draw from the idea that like she is this character who's tied to destiny herself, because from day one she was part of a prophecy that would end the world. So her having the ability to prophesy something might on some level like have meaning or resonance there. Like I'm not completely throwing it out, but I thought it was awkward. And also it gets increasingly awkward because like this is just the first one, so like when it first happens here, you're like, okay, but they keep talking about destiny every single episode over and over again in very explicit terms, and keep talking about how like Ciri and Geralt are tied to each other. And this is in the same storyline where like the book The Last Wish is named after the story The Last Wish, and in the story The Last Wish, Geralt and Yennefer are tied to each other, and that's a thing that isn't really resolved all the way until Witcher 3. And so like that's way off. Like as far as I know, that's just like a permanent thing in these books, is the way that Yennefer and Geralt get tied to each other fate-wise. So you have Ciri being tied to Geralt by destiny, and Yennefer being tied to Geralt by destiny, which have fun picking apart the how female characters and agency works here, because it's there's some stuff that might. It's something where like I kind of blew past it the first time around, but when I was explaining these storylines to someone once, I was like, yeah, this doesn't sound great when I say it out loud, does it? The way that all these women are bound to Geralt by fate, and they seem to not be able to escape him, is like a little unfortunate. But that's just the thing we go for. And weirdly, I was like, okay, yeah, the girl in the forest is your destiny. I'm like, okay, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know about the story where Geralt goes into the forest and finds Ciri. So I guess they're just going to set that up now for some reason. I'm sure, why not? That's actually not what happens. They get rid of that entire storyline entirely. So that Geralt going into the elf woods never happens in this storyline. So they're actually setting up a completely different set of woods, and it starts to get really funny because you realize how much of this world is covered in woods, and you're like, oh shit, this is whoops. It just stood out to me as being funny, like how stupid it is to say the girl in the woods is your destiny. It's like, girl, cool, half the population is girls and half of this country is woods, but thanks. I'm really gonna figure out what you mean by that. But overall, the Renfrey storyline I largely liked, and the battle choreography in the first episode of Geralt taking down her entire squad one by one and then doing a relatively cool fight with her too is all like, yeah, I kind of like this. I'm having a good time. This is a good first episode. The only thing that stood out to me the entire first episode that was kind of iffy was the weird prophecy moment. But there's one thing about this episode that gets retroactively iffy, which is the Ciri storyline. Because the Ciri storyline in this episode shows the fall of Sentra. So it shows Ciri's relationship with a little bit with the villagers, which gets subverted later a little bit. It shows Ciri's relationship with her step uncle, is that what you call him at that point? Ciri's relationship with her grandmother, and also the back and forth between like the step uncle and Ciri versus the step uncle and her and the grandmother, and like I immediately liked this cast of characters and this location and was kind of having a good time with this. And then they all die horribly in that episode. Like it's actually rather shocking because like you see the step uncle and he sees like this charismatic character that they're like giving a lot of personality to, like he's going to be around for a while, and he gets taken out immediately, and you're like, oh, okay. And then the grandmother also dies, and that's the fall of Sentra, and it's the sacking and burning of the entire city. And Ciri has to go on the run and all that. And you're like, okay, and like that didn't necessarily bother me, and at the time. Just the normal disappointment of like, oh, I like that character and they're dead now, but that's fine, generally speaking. As it turns out, those characters are going to show up in future episodes because Geralt's storyline takes place in the past, and so he interacts with those characters later, by which I mean earlier. So that's why those actors were good, were especially noteworthy for like their good performances and good writing and all that, and like characterization being relatively heavy for their short screen time was actually because they're both going to be in like 3 episodes each is the real reason, because of that. So that was kind of reassuring, and like, oh, thank God they're back for a bit, even though it's tragic because you know what's going to happen to them. But no, the real reason I take issue with this first episode is that showing the destruction of Cintran in the first episode is a really good, strong first episode. But the season didn't necessarily have anything else, any other chips to cash for this season. So they just come back and show the sacking of Sentra again later in the season. You're like, no, you already showed this. What are you doing? But we'll get to that when I get to that one. But spoilers for later. That's the episode that I think is the waste of time, garbage episode that might as well be cut from the entire season because it's just stupid. It was a stupid episode, which is when they re-show the sacking of Sentra. Should I just get into that now? I should probably just get into that now. But basically, yeah, I'll just talk about that now. Basically, in a lot of shows like Game of Thrones and many other things that have like big character deaths and so on, a really popular thing is to have the penultimate episode be the big one. So you have a big season of like 10 episodes or whatever, and then the penultimate season, which is the second to last for those that mix up what penultimate means, is the one where a major character dies, a big thing happens, you have like a beheading or an assassination or a wedding or two, and the big thing happens, and then like the final episode is like you resolving that, kind of all of the characters reacting to that, because the big shocking thing probably happened near the end of the penultimate episode. So you give one episode to kind of breathe out. Your finale is like conventional wisdom about seasons used to kind of say that the finale would be the big shocking episode, but it's becoming somewhat popular to have the penultimate episode be the big shocking episode and the finale be every character kind of reacting to the big thing that happened. And that, and in some level, I think that's kind of better because it's like all the characters process the thing a little bit, and then you have a better idea of what the show might do next, as opposed to just being like having a shocking cliffhanger and then you come back a year later to a show to pick up the pieces after that cliffhanger. I think the characters processing that often helps reorient them to whatever they're going to be doing next, and then you get to anticipate the season that'll happen next a little bit more, because you actually have some idea of what might happen or what characters are planning on doing, or which characters you care about are going to maybe be in conflict with each other as a result of that thing, and so on. So this episode tries to do that, but it blew its load already with the same fucking the same thing, and they didn't have another thing to show later, so they just came back and watched this and showed the same thing again. So in episode 7, Before a Fall, they just show the invasion of Sentra again, and they largely add nothing to it. It's like a clip show. It's like when a show's been around for decades, not decades, for like a decade, and then they have a clip show where they show a bunch of clips from previous episodes. That's what episode 7 of the season is that they basically just re-show a bunch of clips and context from the fall of Sentra from the first episode, and at most they augment the scene. Like there's a scene where the grandmother, the Queen of Sentra, is laying in a she's laying on a couch and she's kind of dying, but she's like, no, my death would be much more dramatic than this. But she's also like expositing certain things and making some choices. They slightly extend the scene to add one more little conversation to it, basically, and like there's a couple scenes like that, and the main reveal happening here is basically just that, like, in the first episode, Yennefer wasn't even introduced yet, and Geralt wasn't acknowledging the fall of Sentra at all because he's in a different place and in a different time. So in the fall of Sentra episode, they just show that, wow, the whole time Geralt, who we never saw in the first episode, actually was in Sentra during the fall, but he was in a jail cell, and it's like it's mostly like a throwaway, a few scenes about like why Geralt didn't help at all during the fall of Sentra, but also why he was there, because the season was kind of setting up the idea that Geralt was pursuing Ciri because of his destiny and so on. But like, it's just blah. Like it largely is just a recreation of the same sequence of events again. And there's a few scenes where Yennefer is acknowledging that like the fall of Sentra is going to happen, and there's like a couple council meetings with mages where they're anticipating the war. So at most there's a couple scenes that are setting up the finale episode that's going to be this big war, but by and large the penultimate episodes are just a massive waste of time, and it could have not been that. See, if they didn't do this weird thing where they insisted on having Ciri be in every episode, and also insisted on having the first episode be this big dramatic death where you have like the death of Sentra and the Queen of Sentra falling out the window and all these other scenes that are all evocative and shit, you could have just saved this all for the penultimate episode if you were going to show it anyway. Like, but they insisted on showing it in the first episode, so they just show it twice. And I just found this kind of baffling and kind of embarrassing and confusing. And it's like, I don't know, did they not think that the cool sword fight that Geralt does at the end of the first episode was not going to be enough for a standalone episode? They had to also show like a war happening with Nilfgaard, because this goes well beyond foreshadowing, and it's just actually showing the climax of the season preemptively before you have context for it, so that later on when they show it again later, it's just spoiled. And like on some level, when we're later doing the promise of surprise or whatever it's called, the something of surprise, I forget what it's called. When that stuff's happening later with the hedgehog, it's like kind of tragic and bittersweet, because like all these characters that I like that I know are going to die are in this episode and stuff like that. And like that's like there's some value to having that particular feeling of like knowing certain characters are going to die, but getting to see them before their death in a different context and like building that out retroactively. But if they were then going to show the sacking of Sentra again later in the season, it really seems like they should have just not shown it in the first episode at all, and just developed those characters over a series of episodes. Like show us Ciri interacting with her family and letting us like them. But like show these in chronological order. So like you show the season, you show the episode where the promise happens, which introduces the Queen of Sentra. Then you show Ciri getting born maybe, and you show Ciri like growing close to their family, and then the big climax of the season, Ciri gets attacked, and because Sentra gets attacked and Ciri has to flee and all that. Like, you didn't have to, like, you really didn't have to like tell this in this weird order. Like, overall, this could have been, they could have framed everything about Ciri completely different, because what we get instead is Ciri just kind of running through the woods a lot and wandering around. Some of it's with her elf friends she makes, and some of it's just her on her own, and she's just kind of wandering randomly, hoping to encounter Geralt. So she's kind of just in stasis the entire episode. So if you just introduce Ciri in like the first or second episode and her family just briefly, and she gets to, like, you know, we get to like these characters a bit. I don't know. It just could have been handled differently. Although, really, because of the fact that we're going to then have the birth of Ciri midway through the season, you might have been better off just letting Ciri not exist at the beginning of the show. Just get to the episode where Ciri's introduced as being, you know, the baby that someone's pregnant with, and then after she's born, start weaving her into the story a bit, but let the early episodes, let Yennefer and Geralt's stories breathe more without having to deal with Ciri all the time. Like, I feel like that might have just been generally better, but we'll get to this as we go through. Let's try to go a little chronologically here, because I'm bouncing around a lot. The second episode is 4 Marks. It's the adaptation of The Edge of the World by The Last Wish. This was the first episode that I found actively frustrating. When I look at the first episode, I enjoyed it while I watched it, and really don't think there's anything particularly wrong with the episode. It's just that in the context of the season, there's problems that show up in the first episode because of the overall structure of the season being really confusing and strange and what they chose to do. But the second episode, I immediately found frustrating as somebody who read the book, and it was just actively a problem for me. See, episode 2 is where they introduce Yennefer, and Yennefer is this hunchback character who is abused by her father and treated like garbage, and he's like clearly just revolted by her and furious that he ever created someone like this. Like, it's one of those stories where somebody is not at all welcoming to anyone being different and revolted by the idea that they created them. So it's like the fact that it has anything to do with his genes makes it like his shame. Like, it's one of those kind of awful stories. And then Yennefer gets like, she when she's dealing with this angst, she teleports magically to a wizard tower, and she's like, what's happening, where am I, and all that. And it's like, oh, this is kind of a fun storyline here. Like, I actually like Yennefer's story a lot of the time. And she's like, your magic's actually rather impressive. You ported here. And she's like, what, ported? And then she has no idea what the fuck he's talking about, that kind of stuff, because she doesn't know she's a mage, and she used magic on accident because of her sheer desire, I guess. Because here we contextualize magic as being chaos energy. So it's this chaotic power that lets you do these insane things, but you kind of, like, your ability to control it's limited and so on. And this is all good stuff. The problem we're going to get to is that this is also a Geralt episode, because everyone has to be in every episode. See, we're still going to be developing Yennefer's backstory next episode. She's still going to be a hunchback working her way through the mage stuff. So I really feel like a solution here might have been to just give Yennefer a standalone episode. I don't know how you guys feel about this stuff, so feel free to chime in what you think about not standalone episodes, but single character episodes, but I like them a lot. In particular, watching like The Walking Dead, which I still watch, even though I've got so many issues with so many things about it. I don't know. Part of me likes to think about the issues. Part of me likes to think about like the problems I have with stuff. So I can still enjoy a thing even if it's not good, because I can like kind of just know what it is as a concept and kind of experience it. It's kind of like why I'm happy I watched. Like, well, I'm bummed out it turned out the way it did. I'm happy I watched the most recent Star Wars movie, just because I get to like think about the weird fucking mess that it is and like that whole thing. But one of the things I do like about Walking Dead is that it will do standalone episodes that are just one character. Oftentimes, it's filling in their backstory. So like, there's a character named Morgan that was in the first episode of the show, then vanishes for seasons at a time, then comes back, then vanishes again, and then he finally becomes a mainline character way later in the show. And after all that happens, you're like, wow, Morgan, you went through some major transformations while you were gone. Like, you seem pretty chill in the first episode, but you were in a dark place when we saw you a few seasons later, and now you're kind of in a different place now, and I got questions about like what happened there. Well, boy, does Walking Dead have your back, because there was like an hour-long Morgan episode that was a standalone episode. I keep saying standalone, that's not the right thing to call it. But there was an hour-long flashback episode that was entirely filling in all these backstory events about just this one character. And I like that approach to a season of storytelling in a show. I actually do dig that kind of thing. I think some people might take an issue with it, and some people might have an issue with like how it affects the pacing of the season or something, but like getting to focus purely on one episode and letting their story be told in its entirety without having to cut between different things and figure out how to squish it into an episode, I find that stuff very good. Like, because I figure if you're going to set out on the mission of telling a character's backstory, you might as well just fucking commit, right? Just go for it. So like if episode 2 or 3 was just 100% Yennefer's backstory, and we're just going to completely commit to introducing her to the story. Like, you got a couple episodes with Geralt, here's Yennefer, she's going to be important, don't worry about it. It's worth sitting through this episode, even though you're kind of confused why you're now watching a completely different character, because she's going to matter in the long term. Although another thing you can do, which is what a lot of shows do, is you would introduce Yennefer first, just doing shit, you know, like in these books that the show's based on. Just show us a Yennefer storyline, and then do her backstory later. Because if we already met Yennefer and we already like Yennefer, then going back and showing her backstory is like, oh no, Yennefer and stuff like that. And also, like, if you see bitch Yennefer with her like prominent chin and her perfect hair and all that other stuff, because it's, you know, it's the Yennefer that's a witch, and then you flash back to an entire episode of her backstory where she's like this hunchback girl that's shoveling shit, then it's like it's a shocking reveal of like this very significant physical difference you're seeing. And like that kind of difference between the two of them is like that's actually like a pretty effective storytelling tactic, is to go back in time and see how different they used to be, and you have questions now, and so now you're engaged for this whole episode. So like if you're worried that having a whole episode on just Yennefer early on is going to throw people off because you're spending a whole episode with a character that you haven't met yet, then don't. Just show Yennefer first, show some Yennefer storylines, maybe start with the one where Yennefer and Geralt interact with each other, which is also how the books work. You know, the Last Wish storyline is the one where they get bound together. Then after you've already met Yennefer, you can flash back to her entire backstory as a full episode of just that. And then you get to really flesh out that character that you've now introduced. And like, I think that might be a better approach. But instead what they do is that they keep flashing to Yennefer's backstory over and over again, in particular taking up like half of both of these episodes. And in particular, the episode 4 marks, episode 2, is so heavy on Yennefer that it really just squeezes Geralt out of the episode, even though he's still in the episode. And so the end result is that you kind of waste a Geralt storyline by not committing to telling it properly, but still throwing it away. Like, they can't use that story now because they've already used it. So it's good. It's gone for good now. They just shat it out and wasted it because they wanted to focus on Yennefer for most of the episode, but still refused to not have an episode without Geralt. So they spent one, essentially. And it's frustrating because that was a storyline I liked. And I like basically all of them. Like, one of the things that's really nice about these is that if you like get a little blurb about one of these storylines in these books, and you remind yourself like, oh, that was the one with that. Oh, that's the one with the thing and the stuff. Oh yeah, that one was fun. Like, you almost always have that spark of recognition when you realize which short story you're referring back to, and you're like, oh yeah, that was cool because that's the one where that happened. It was like this interesting little thing. Like, there's always a twist. There's always a surprising reveal, or like a level of detail or texture to this or that character you weren't expecting when you went into it at the beginning. And like, there's always, these stories consistently surprise you, and they're worth telling in their full context. And so it's really a bummer if you abridge them down to the point of being unrecognizable. And that's what happens right off the bat in episode 2. So episode 2 is about the edge of the world. The edge of the world is actually kind of fun. Sorry, this might be a little incoherent because there's some relatively long jump cuts here. Because I do want to review this information as we go a little bit more. So, in the Edge of the World, in the book, what's happening is that Geralt already knows Dandelion, and they're going on this big expedition further and further to the farther reaches of all of society and the known world, because he's just desperate for work. Geralt's having trouble getting Witcher work. This is one of those narratives where, even though we're like in the first book of The Witcher, like the Witchers have come and gone in the past. It's kind of like the Jedi in A New Hope, where like they are a past order that people barely remember ever existed in the first place, essentially. And so it's, if you're still functioning in that system, like you don't necessarily have like stuff to do all the time. And the Witcher needs to eat. So he needs to always find work, because that's how he survives as a person in this society. He needs to find monster hunting jobs. So he keeps going further and further into the further reaches of all of society, because he's just not finding work. And Dandelion's just kind of along for the ride, because he often is. Because he's often like looking for stories and so on by following Geralt around. And he also kind of just skims a bit and takes advantage of Geralt here and there by just, you know, his hospitality. He often gets fed as a result of hanging out with the Witcher, and also then gets stories he can take off on his journeys and then come back later and so on. So they're going further and further. They hear about this devil that's been a problem, and so the local elder wants them to deal with this devil, but don't kill him. They just need to get rid of him. Like he's just been a problem, but don't kill him. So they go out to interact with this devil, and this guy at first it's just shouting noises at them, but eventually it's kind of cursing them out and yelling at them. It's like, oh, it's intelligent and you can understand it. Okay. It's a goat man, relatively. It's just like a satyr and so on. It's a familiar image for people. Things escalate. Dandelion keeps taunting it, and things keep getting worse till the devil is throwing these metal balls at them, and Geralt and Dandelion actually flee the scene, and they go back to town and they try to learn more about this guy. They learn that he's a Sylvan. They interact with these different characters in town that can help them gain this information with the local folklore and so on. And so they go back out there and they interact with the Sylvan again. And like the Sylvan wants to play games, so like he's throwing poems at them. Like it's very Gollum-y. Yeah. Like, we'll play at riddles if you don't like physical games. I'll give you a riddle in a minute, and if you guess it, you win and I leave. If you don't, I stay and you leave. Rack your brains, because this riddle isn't easy. It grows in soft clay, not far from the stream. Little pink leaves, pods small and full. It grows in soft clay, not far from the stream. On a long stalk, its flower is moist. But to a cat, please show it not, 'cause if you do, he'll eat the lot. It's like they have this kind of back and forth about these riddles and other contests and conflicts. Because they're really just, this guy's just a problem. Like they find out that when they were back in town, they found out earlier that like they tried to use local folklore to banish the devil, and they tried to like appease it with offerings, but that mostly just led to a result where now the devil's well fed and also has like these metal balls to throw around. So they kind of supplied it with his weapon on accident because they thought it was like a thing that would banish him, and it was just all bullshit. They were trying to get by without a Witcher is the thing, because Witchers are so long gone that it's only Geralt and a few other people, and basically everyone else is gone, that like people have to try to figure out like homegrown remedies to monsters like this Sylvan, and they're misidentifying the creature to begin with in half the time, and all their solutions are wrong and so on. And the Witcher's trying to deal with it, but the Witcher doesn't want to kill the Sylvan because he is sentient and intelligent, so that means that he has to reason with it more likely, or figure out some other solution, because that, generally speaking, Geralt's code doesn't involve killing intelligent creatures. He keeps dealing with this. They're doing these riddles and puzzles, and eventually it escalates to a bit of a physical altercation, and ultimately what happens is somebody sneaks up on Geralt and knocks him out, and they wake up tied to a tree. Geralt's tied to a tree, and these elves are all planning on executing him, and they're going on about the crimes of humanity and how like elf society, all the remnants of elves have been pushed to the very borders of all of society, the edge of the world, as it were. And like these are these crimes, and like because Geralt knows about them, he has to die and stuff like that kind of stuff. And so they're planning on executing him, and it's actually the Sylvan that's pleading to not kill to not kill Geralt in this situation. And like, there's just, there's a bunch of textures and back and forths and surprise reveals, like this idea of like the surprise indication this is all like an elf storyline, by the way, for example, because you thought it was a Sylvan storyline, but it turns out the Sylvan was like stealing resources to help the elves, and like they're all kind of in cahoots because he feels bad about how the elves have been, are in such a fucked situation because of the humans and so on. And Geralt's being blamed for the crimes of humanity, even though he's somebody who is himself outcast from humanity and only really given any modicum of respect for as little help he can give them in these really specific situations, where then it goes right back to being reviled once he's not hunting a monster for them and so on. It's, a lot of these stories are different groups that kind of parallel Geralt in different ways, but also like there's just a lot of texture here. Like, you have this loud-mouthed, swearing troublemaker Sylvan that's just a force of like mischief and seems like such a problem, but it's also like kind of a low stakes fight because nobody's trying to kill anybody else for this whole Sylvan situation. But then it's a reveal that like all this troublemaking that the Sylvan's doing is actually like a front for helping the elves, and the elves are actually much more willing to kill people, and there's other things going on. And it's like there's a bunch of back and forth that are interesting. In the show, one issue is that they need to introduce Dandelion. So Dandelion is introduced in this episode. His name's Jaskier, which is actually what he's called in the original version of The Witcher. In its original language, his name is Jaskier, which means buttercup. So he was always named after a flower. And in different regions, Jaskier is named after a different flower. So here we have Dandelion. I've heard somebody explain in chat somewhere, I think, that like what the German version is, which is another flower, that it's another name that also means another flower, and so on. So like they kind of localize his name per region to a different flower that evokes the same vague imagery or feeling, because like buttercup feels different here than it does that it does in Polish, apparently. So they went with dandelion here, like that kind of stuff. They go with a particular flower name for each region that kind of evokes the same idea, because calling him buttercup here does not give the same result as calling him jaskier in Polish does. Like the flower means different things to different cultures and so on. But in the books, jaskier, as far as I'm aware, is not introduced, at least not in these two standalone stories books. He just exists and is somebody who knows Geralt, and that's it. Like, you see Ciri and Yennefer meet Geralt in their respective storylines, but Dandelion and some of other Geralt's associates just already are existing forces of nature, essentially. Like, they're just part of his life, and they might as well have always been there. But the show insists on introducing him, so they create a scene where Geralt and Dandelion meet for the first time in a bar, and it's right around the time that Geralt is also going out on this. And by the way, I do like the scene where they meet each other. I'm not complaining about that necessarily. It's just that by adding that, they are eating away at more time in the episode. And this is already the episode where, like, I want to say the majority of the episode is spent on Yennefer's storyline. And they also added in the introduction of Dandelion, so they're adding that. But then they go on this mission, and right off the bat, I'm already iffy. So they encounter the Sylvan in the bushes. The Sylvan throws a metal ball at Geralt. It hits him in the head. He's bleeding, but he makes it. And then Dandelion kind of laughs about that, but he gets hit by a metal ball and it knocks him out. It's like, okay, Dandelion's down. Geralt tackles the Sylvan, and the Sylvan kind of amusingly is like, I am a Sylvan, a rare and beautiful creature, or a rare and intelligent creature, which is like something that you shout at. It's like, it's such a great, like I like that. If he, considering he says like one thing in the entire scene, it's a very funny thing to say, is that he's essentially declaring out loud immediately why a witcher should not kill him, because he's one, rare, and two, intelligent, which are the two things that Geralt doesn't want to kill. Is he doesn't want to make any species extinct unless they're really awful, I guess. And he doesn't want to kill intelligent creatures. So this guy is he's a quick study. He knows what he's supposed to say to not have a witcher kill him, which I found amusing. Then Geralt gets knocked out. So that whole intro part we had talked about of like having like interactions with the the Sylvan, where like Dandelion and the Sylvan have a kind of a back and forth, and like there's like an escalating tension and like some really amusing stuff, because like the Sylvan is kind of a funnily written character in general, and so is Dandelion, so having two kind of funny characters yelling at each other is kind of fun. And then them running back to town and learning about the Sylvan, and then them coming back and like the Sylvan challenging them to riddles and stuff like that. All of that's completely cut. He just throws two metal balls, says one line, and then Geralt gets knocked out, and we're done with that entire part of the story of the Edge of the World. And then they wake up in a new location, and the elves are once again having pretty much the same interaction, as far as I remember, all the way down to one of them having their nose broken by Geralt via a headbutt or whatever, from his binding. Where like they blame him for all these things because they blame the humans for all these things. They're gonna have to kill him, and the Sylvan kind of takes Geralt's side, like don't kill him and so on, and then they eventually get let go. And then Dandelion, because his job is to tell stories about Geralt to sort of repay him, but also like to like spin these stories of like, oh, this is why Geralt's actually a hero and people should pay him, is spun as like it becomes this song, Toss a Coin to Your Witcher, which is like a song that's a through line throughout the entire season, and people keep referencing outside of the show and so on, and it's like has larger significance to it. And it's born from this not great episode where like nothing really happens in the episode for the most part. All the interesting texture of the story is completely left on the cutting room floor, and it's like only the most token thing. Like I tweeted about this and people saw this probably, but it was like they essentially made they turned the episode into fan service. They didn't really adapt it for the most part, or at least the first half in particular. They didn't really adapt so much as reference, which is not as good, because they just have a Sylvan. He throws metal balls, and he shouts things. Check, check, check. Those are the three characteristics, right? And like all those details are established in like 30 seconds, and then you move on from them. And I'll remind you, these episodes are an hour long, and this whole thing about the Sylvan being this troublemaker, loudmouth that challenges you to riddles and throws metal balls and all these other things, it's just squeezed down to those few seconds of like, he shouts a thing, he throws some balls, and then Geralt gets knocked out in a few seconds. It's like a background cameo in Ready Player One. We're like, it's that Optimus Prime? I recognize that from the thing. And like, if you've read the book, you're like, that means something to you. But if you're just watching the show, you're like, the what character? Like, you might have to remind somebody that character existed because of how fast it came and went as a person. And that's just kind of a bummer. And it's just kind of a bummer that the story doesn't have a lot going on. Like, I do kind of like the anticlimax of how Geralt just gets released and he doesn't necessarily even solve the problem himself, which is true for both versions of the story. But the fact that the story comes and goes so quickly in the show is just kind of a bummer, and it's kind of weak for a second episode. I think the show's really relying on the fact that you're probably engaged in Yennefer's storyline, so you're focused on just that part. So you're probably not that worried about the fact that Geralt's story kind of sucks this episode. But at the same time, it's the introduction of Dandelion and the birth of that song that people keep referencing. So it's like, it's just, once again, I'll go back to my idea that like it would have been nicer if Yennefer just had a standalone episode about her past that wasn't eating up time that was also being spent to adapt other storylines. Because then this storyline could have had its time to breathe, and it's kind of a fun storyline. It's kind of low stakes. They're just having it out with this goddamn Sylvan. If you want to have your subversion of expectations that this Witcher universe often has, like having a shouting match with this rude creature in under an apple tree or whatever the hell it was, like, is a pretty amusing scenario to engage with, and it helps expand people's idea of what the Witcher is as a universe. Because so far it's just been about a bunch of dangerous monsters and threats of death and so on. So it's just kind of an amusing storyline, and having it shrunk down to almost nothing is just disappointing by contrast. And so after a strong first episode, I was really feeling mixed right off the bat on the second episode, because I was so caught off guard by how iffy this is. Because it feels like what you do when you watch like a fantasy movie in the theater that's an adaptation of like a 800-page novel, and the movie's only 2 hours long, and like stuff just keeps going ga 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 ga, and the pacing's totally fucked, and like entire ideas come and go in only a few seconds, and like the editing's too fast, and concepts are underdeveloped and characters come and go like lightning, like the goddamn like Aragon movie adaptation, for example. That's the feeling I don't want to have, generally speaking. And I gotta say, like, going into the show, I didn't know it was going to be an adaptation of Sword of Destiny and The Last Wish. I was kind of hoping it would just be new stories with Geralt and everybody. Like, they were just going to make up stuff. That kind of would have been nice, because then they wouldn't be so constrained to, like, this episode is this short story, but we also want to do this in the episode, but it has to do both of these things within that time limit, so stuff's going to have to give. Like, if you have a storyline for the entire arc of each season based on each character, and it's all planned and written from scratch, it might be more coherent, although the show kind of shows how they might be good or bad at that at the same time, because the Ciri storyline is so blah, but the Yennefer storyline is actually pretty all right. So I don't know. I can't tell you whether or not they would have done a good job at making their own stories or not, but as it is, it's a book adaptation, and they are adapting these stories, and so I don't think it's unfair to say that that's a badly adapted story, because otherwise those details don't matter. Like, if they just wanted to have a showdown with the Sylvan, I mean, with the elves, where the elves where you get to explain the political situation between the elves and the humans, like, that doesn't require the Sylvan at all. So the whole Sylvan mission is largely irrelevant. Like, all you really had to do was have any situation where Geralt would get kidnapped, but they go out of their way to make this entire CGI character of the Sylvan, and they kind of just, I don't know. It frustrates me by just evoking the storyline without actually adapting it. And it's like, I would almost rather they do their own thing, like CD Projekt Red does, where they just make new Witcher stories from scratch, building upon what exists already, instead of telling the same story but worse. Speaking of the Yennefer storyline, and I can't tell you which one's which, because the Yennefer's storyline is split over the course of a series of episodes, but I can't talk about them on an episodic basis without, like, going into great detail of, like, researching what happened or rewatching the episodes. So, like, my Ciri and Yennefer stuff is not going to be tied to a specific episode when I discuss it, because largely I can't tell you what episode these things happened in, because they are a more traditional storyline where a series of events happen in chronological order, and sometimes a previous episode is just picking up where the last one left off, whereas all of the Witcher storylines are standalone. Not standalone, but there's like a skip between them where he's in a different place at a different time, and because they're a bunch of short stories. This Yennefer story that's split between 2 episodes and takes up a lot of the time of the second and third episode, there's a few things I took issue with that just felt like there's deleted scenes that should have been there that would make the episodes feel better. So Yennefer gets kidnapped by the witches, and by kidnapped I mean she gets purchased because her dad's awful, and she's forced to live with them, and so she starts getting trained as being a witch, and it's like, okay, this is interesting, sure. You get to see a bunch of other witch characters, and like, I think you might see Triss there, but you also see the evil Nilfgaardian witch that's going to come up later. You see her being trained there, I think, too, and so on. And they also establish some of the rules about spellcasting. One of them is this idea that when you cast a spell, the power has to come from something. So like a flower or a tree or even a person will like lose their living essence over the course of the cast of the spell being expended and so on. So the first lesson is that they have them levitate a rock. And when they do that, everyone's trying to say the word and no one can seem to manage to do it. And then one person does it. And I think it might have been the woman who becomes the Nilfgaardian witch later or whatever. She levitates it. It's like, wow, she's doing it. Everyone look. Then I'm like, look at your hand. And her hand like shrivels up like the Crypt Keeper. And she screams, which is fitting. That's a correct thing to do in that situation. And then it's never addressed again. I don't mean like this. I don't mean like the cost of spellcasting is never addressed again. I mean like her hand is never addressed again. And I think she might have even been the character who shows up later in the show. And I'm like, huh? I'm confused. Because they establish that her hand shrivels up, but nobody ever explains like, oh yeah, just take the salve and that'll heal up, or oh no, you're fucked, your hand's fucked for the rest of your life now, or her hand falls off, or like, I don't know, no explanation. You just see her hand shrivel up and like, that seems like a really important bad thing to happen to somebody, And then no one talks about it, including the person it happened to, and the teacher. The teacher never says anything. All she does is say that spellcasting has a cost, and so that's why there was a flower on the table, and then everyone picks up the flower for their additional attempts at spellcasting. No one expresses additional concern that this person's hand shriveled up, including her. And in fact, the moment she points out the flower and how that works, everybody just picks up the flower and intently starts trying to cast the spell. And it's like, none of you are afraid at all that this person's hand just shriveled up like a little nightmare, like claw, like she's a corpse now. Why is no one worried about this? Like, did they? I swear they must have had like. I doubt that it was written this way. I almost certainly think that like the editor like cut something out that like made that scene more natural, because they were just so packed for time, because all these stories don't have the time to breathe that they should have. That's my guess. I don't know, because no one seems to care that this person's hand got really fucked up. Everyone's just they just zoom in on Yennefer, and she's like, and she's chanting the word, and she picks up the flower, and she's so dedicated, and it's like, you're not worried even a little bit about the thing that just happened? I feel like people should be worried. But then there's another weird reaction from Yennefer later on, which is that there's a character that she refers to as being her friend throughout this entire 2-episode little arc here. And like at a later point, there's the ascension that's supposed to happen, where everyone gets to become like proper witches now. They're going to become ascended via this ritual. They take them down to this pool in the basement, this white glowing pool. And she says this word at them one by one, the teacher does. And they all turn into yellow eels, which then get kicked in the pond. And that's where they live now. Like, they're all gonna... That's it. Like, there's a line she says a couple times where, like, sometimes the best thing a flower can do for us is die. And so, like, she sees these people as, like, failed or disposable, so they're not going to become witches. They're going to live as eels in this pond forever. They lost all agency. Like, she even says she takes the control away from them, which is like, wow, if you want to talk about, once again, if you want to talk about the agency of female characters in this show, the fact that 2 of them are bound to Geralt by destiny and can't escape that, and one of them's forced to love him at some point, and also the fact that like these characters, there's a whole like cult of women where like these women have their agency ripped from them permanently, and then they just slowly die as these eels in a pond as a power source, is like, huh, that's a thing to process. Fantasy writing, huh? No, the specific thing I want to bring up about this is actually just Yennefer's reaction, which is like, you turned my friend into a slug, and then she's like, it's an eel actually. Then she never talks about it again. Yennefer herself said that was her friend, but she doesn't seem to care that this person's permanently an eel now. Like, Yennefer's just over it immediately. In fact, she ends the scene smiling. She ends up smiling in this scene, and I'm like, what the fuck? What? Yennefer, you said it was your friend, and she just got totally fucked over, and you're not revolted by this or afraid about this, or like, this is the raw power your teacher has, is that she can just at any moment turn you into this practically not an inanimate object, but like just remove all agency from you and throw you in a pond, and that's the end of you, and you're not worried about that. And I know that people are going to be thinking about this. Like a full like 4 episodes later, it comes up later where Yennefer goes to like she goes back to like this location decades later, and she's like spiteful now about all the things that happened here, and like she's about to like tell she's on the verge of telling all these new students about the eels and so on. It's like, sure, but why didn't that bother you back then when it was happening in front of you? Like, it's weird to, like, it's one of those things where like they acknowledge it later, but acknowledging it later doesn't fix the fact that it was super weird when it was happening, that like she just didn't care and even smiled at her friend becoming an eel. And it's like, the tone of the scene gets really weird. This also happens with the fact that Geralt does almost nothing in this episode too, which is the fact that like later on Dandelion singing this Toss a Coin to Your Witcher song, and the story of him fighting these elves has spread, and then Geralt just straight up acknowledges they're like, nah, basically nothing happened. That story is all bullshit. But it's like, acknowledging it later doesn't change the fact that that's what the story was in the moment. So it's like, I don't know, just acknowledging it doesn't really fix the feedback necessarily. That's just a whole thing. They also added the detail apparently that we always heard that witchers and witches both can't have children. We know that the number of toxins and metamorphoses and mutagens and all that shit that go into a witcher lead to them becoming sterile. That's pretty explicitly told, I believe. But witches are more vague about it. There's just some idea that witches can't have children, and I don't think it's super detailed in its telling ever. But in this show, there is the metamorphosis, where all of the witches go from whatever they were before to being quote unquote perfect people, like appearance wise. And so everyone's going to morph into, well, actors basically. Like they were all glammed down and they were all like not wearing makeup before. And in Yennefer's case, she was like set up as like a hunchback with like a crooked jaw and all these other things. And some of the other characters have like scars on their faces to kind of highlight that they're like pre-perfect witches. Whereas once they go through their astonishing metamorphosis, they just look like the actor that plays them now, basically. In this one, they established that because like magic has a cost, I guess. In this one's case, the specific price of this metamorphosis is that they cut your uterus out of your body. They just cut your uterus right out. So that's why Yennefer can't have children. Now we know they cut her uterus out. You literally see it, like they put it in a pan, like this floppy prop, gross fleshy uterus thing. You see it, and I'm like, oh, okay. I guess we know that now in more detail, at least in this particular version of the universe. Gotcha. Really fucks with the part where like there's an ongoing thing where Yennefer wants to have kids, and like in this one in particular, she keeps talking about getting a cure for having kids, and it's like it would kind of help the storyline if the nature of her not being able to have a kids was more vague to us as the audience, because like the exceptions of like, oh no, witches are just sterile or whatever, or whatever, or barren, I mean, would almost be more acceptable, because we'd be like, oh wow, witches can't have kids. Oh, good luck, Yennefer, finding a cure for that. But we literally saw her uterus get cut out of her body and thrown away, so it makes it a slightly bigger leap to be thinking about like how is she gonna fix that? What is a cure for uterus begone? Because that's her uterus begone. It's not existing. I feel like that muddies the waters on the idea of her seeking a cure a little bit in an unnecessary way, because I think viewers might get in their own heads about like that idea of like, how do you fix that? I guess maybe she can grow her uterus back, because since she was able to metamorphose her body. But that kind of becomes a new problem, because like you establish that they can just morph their body on the fly via these rituals, but the cost of morphing the rest of her body is cutting her uterus out, apparently. But if that's the case, if all that's in her way is the fact that her uterus is gone and not like some other larger thing about witches that makes them barren, that's more magical in nature or whatever, if it's literally just that she's missing an organ, you would think that the cure might actually be easier than the show's making it out to be. Like, you could have an organ transplant of a uterus, or maybe there's just a spell that grows a uterus. Since you were able to change every other part of her body, it's hard not to think like maybe she could just get her uterus back, in which case seems like it'd be easier than the show's making it out to be, because she's going to some pretty extensive lengths to regain the ability to have children, and it's just her uterus came out. You just got to get a new one. Like, in the world of magic, considering it's established in the same episode where her whole body is being transformed, it doesn't seem that hard, actually. I don't know. I don't know. I have some mixed feelings about that particular development. But overall, it's kind of neat seeing the Yennefer actress like in her getup, where she looks like a genuinely different person. Like there's enough things about her based on like how her skin looks and like how her jaw is sideways and so on, even though it looks a little bit silly because it looks like she just is sticking her tongue into her cheek a little bit, but not. But like there's enough little details about her overall setup that like you're like, okay, she looks like a different person genuinely. So when you see her transformed into the Yennefer that we know largely, you're like, I did a little bit of a double take where I was like, is that even the same actress? Because it's a relatively significant transformation. And I do like some of the elements of how they establish how magic works and stuff like that. It's just some of the specifics of a couple of Yennefer's reactions to certain scenes. I'm like, what? Like specifically the lack of reaction to the eels and the lack of reaction to the claw hand is like, they made those scenes distractingly unnatural feeling, and it made like it felt like the show was just moving too fast for what it was doing in those moments. But for a lot of the Yennefer stuff I kind of like, including the part where like she's like 3 decades later, she's just totally sick of being a witch at this point. She's been doing it for apparently like 30 years, and she's been dealing with all these boring nobles and their stupid problems, and she finds these people asinine and irritating. And then there's an assassination happening. Ooh, boy. And someone's trying to kill the princess that she's currently transporting and her baby. And so Yennefer starts teleporting through different regions. She teleports them to the desert. And now they're in the desert. It's like, oh, we're safe now. And then the guy shows up with the monster again. And you're like, oh, shit, they're tracking you. So it's like a little bit like the Last Jedi situation where like, oh my god, they're tracking us through hyperspace. What's happening? Because like you would think porting away would get you free and clear, especially if you port to like random locations, which the middle of the desert seems pretty random to me. But he's going exactly to where they're going, so it's like they're clearly he's clearly tracking them. And interestingly, Yennefer fails this mission. Doesn't find out how they're being tracked. Like she teleports a few times through portals with the woman and her child, and the guy just keeps coming, and which leads to this like, oh, you useless bitch moment where Yennefer just leaves them to die. And what ends up happening is the woman dies, but then Yennefer returns just in time to try to save the baby, but they end up both getting stabbed, which Yennefer survives, but the baby does not, which is a bummer scene. And Yennefer leads to the scene where Yennefer's talking to a baby's corpse for a while on the beach and so on, which kind of lets you get a feel for where Yennefer is, where she is as a person now, because it's been decades since we last saw her. So it's like that's a real big change for her. But like seeing her fail is interesting, and also seeing this little teleport thing happen is interesting. A little unfortunate that it comes and goes so quickly and you never get resolution for it. So you get to understand what the problem is, which is that they're being tracked somehow, and then they never figure out how they're being tracked because she fails. But it kind of comes and goes. It kind of seems like the point was just to have her kind of touch base with us and tell us where she is as a person right now, because the overall of what's happening in that scenario I don't think ever come up again. I could be wrong. I don't think that sorcerer that came after her even shows up again. Like, because they accomplished what they were going for by killing the baby and the woman. So I guess that's it, really. That's actually most of Yennefer's story until the last wish actually happens. Ciri's story is weird. So they need to come up with more for her to do. So after the sacking of Sentra happens, she runs into the woods, and she encounters a random elf character who I didn't realize we were not supposed to know was an elf, because like, oh, a random person in the woods, they're probably an elf. Oh, they're wearing a hat that covers their ears, they're an elf. Okay. But like later on, it's a reveal that it was an elf, and I'm like, oh, whoops. I already guessed that, but okay. Weirdly, he won't talk. He's a mute until she knows he's an elf, and then he starts talking. I'm like, I don't understand what was not talking part of you hiding your identity as being an elf. Can people tell people are elves when they speak? Because it's just a dude that talks. I don't know why he was silent. Like he was like silently communicating with her and offering her food and like warmth and so on and company. but not talking to her until she realized he was an elf, at which point he starts talking. And I'm like, I don't understand what the point of that was. Is that an adaptation of something I don't remember? Maybe I don't remember which story that is or something, but it's probably not, because the story's not from the books as far as I'm aware. As far as I'm aware, asterisk, I have 6 books to read, but as far as I'm aware, it's an adaptation of the 2 books I've read so far. The 2 of them wander off into the woods, and this is actually an adaptation of a story that I like from one of these books. I don't remember which one it is necessarily, but it's the one where Geralt saves Ciri from the elves in the woods. What happens is that Ciri gets mind controlled, sort of. She feels some kind of calling and just walks into the woods. And there's a detail here, this little fan service moment, which is that they shoot one arrow at the feet of the elf that's with Ciri, who's not under the spell, because he's trying to follow her. It's like, Ciri, what are you doing? Where are you going? The arrow hits the floor, and it's like a warning shot. And then the next arrow hits him. And it's like, oh, hey, it's that detail from the books. Because with these people, Geralt explains that, like, in the books, Geralt explains, like, these people are wildly dangerous. These elves are so good with bows, they will kill you in one shot. But they're just polite enough to give you a warning shot. So they fire off one warning shot, and then you need to leave immediately and flee the scene, because the next shot will go right between your eyes. In this case, it doesn't go between his eyes, it just hits him in the shoulder, and then he's actually fine. And they also kind of kidnap him into the woods, which is weird, because the whole point is to get intruders to not enter. So I'm a little confused there. But also, he's an elf, so why did they shoot another elf? Because I thought they were elves. I thought that was the point. But they shot another elf, which seems kind of productive. But in the books, this is another version of that storyline of, like, there's these elves that are out in the mountains and in the woods, and this is their territory. Anyone who infringes upon any of their territory is killed on sight, because they have no tolerance for humans at this point, because humans have already taken, like, all of their land and pushed them into these, like, essentially, like, reservations, like Native Americans. And, like, they're fighting tooth and nail for this last scrap. And in particular, there's a thing where, like, these elves are being a little unfair in that they keep spreading outward and keep redefining what their boundaries are, which is kind of a problem, because they kill anyone instantly that enters their territory, but they keep kind of pushing outward what they consider to be their territory. But when I say unfair, I mean just not in the grand scale. Like, they're the ones that are being oppressed and hunted and all that. I just mean, like, on an individual basis, the random villagers that aren't really making the choices in this grander scale about what happened and aren't really individually responsible for what happened. I kind of feel bad for how they just are getting picked off and don't even know why, and they just die, which is what's happening with this expanding territory. But basically, in the books, do not go in this territory, you will die. The only exception is Geralt, and that's because Geralt has a particular connection, because he's known as being the White Wolf, and he has a reputation with different groups of people, and so he actually kind of has an in here. And this is the story in the books where Geralt actually finds Ciri, who has been incorporated into this society of these elves. I don't remember if they might have been all female or not, if that was a plot point or not. But they have these waters that, like, make you forget who you are, and you kind of transform into being them. So, like, this is a group of people that they call young girls into their woods, and these girls just walk in kind of under a trance, and then they sort of transform into one of these people. So, like, it's one of those kinds of folk stories where children wander into the woods and become creatures. It's that kind of idea where, like, they become part of their society permanently, and that's their new life now, and they fight anyone else who dares enter. And Geralt's the only person that can really kind of get in, and it's kind of because of his wider reputation and so on. Sorry, gotta keep drinking water periodically through all this, because I talk too fast and for too long, and it wears me out. And ultimately, I don't remember the specific details that well right now, but ultimately Geralt does end up leaving these woods with Ciri. I think he strikes some kind of deal or something, and that's how Geralt and Ciri more or less meet. But in the book, I mean, in the show, Ciri just kind of hangs out with those people in the woods for a few episodes, and then she just leaves. In this case, they have the Nilfgaardian Doppler, which are these doppelganger people that can copy people, and when they copy them, they become them. So they have their abilities and their memories and their personality and so on. Like they can fully integrate. It's not just the thing where somebody pretends to be somebody cosmetically, and then you're like, well, then ask me a question that only Jacob would know, and then they can't answer the question. Like with Dopplers, you're fucked. They know everything. And the Doppler story that's in one of these books is really good. It's not in this show, though. The only Doppler we get is this evil Doppler that lures Ciri out of the woods so that they can take him to Nilfgaard, but then that doesn't work because they realize he's a Doppler and they kind of attack him enough to run away, which is disappointing. So the whole thing, so all this insight we get from Geralt is gone because Geralt never saves Ciri from these people, but also these people aren't what they were in the books anyway. These mountain forest people, they're insular and they kidnap people still, but also you can apparently just leave, and like Ciri leaves with their blessing, and it all seems kind of iffy, but it's also like a sea story. So this all happens as just like is just very stretched across the whole season for Ciri. Is this detail in particular that just kind of happens, and that's most of Ciri's storyline. After that, after she escapes the Doppler, she pretty much just like has a couple more minor scrapes, one of which is the one where she encounters the villagers that she knew back in Sentra, and they don't think fondly of her at this point. But the main thing is that there's a few times where she explodes magic out of her, like she's just eruptively powerful apparently and can't control it. So there's a couple times throughout the season where she does something scary and powerful, but by and large Ciri's storyline is pretty much just that. She flees Sentra, hangs out with some elves for a while, but then leaves, and then has to run from a Doppler, and then she meets Geralt, and that's stretched over 10 episodes, and it keeps eating away at the runtime of every one of those episodes, despite not really being especially interesting, and kind of lacking the texture that these Witcher stories tend to have, because they don't really have the twists and turns and the special details you don't expect and all that. Instead, they're just it kind of just keeps going, and you're like, cool. And everyone keeps telling Geralt that she's his destiny all season, so like you kind of know where she's going to end up. She's going to meet Geralt, and that's how the show ends. The show ends with her meeting Geralt. You're like, all right, cool. That was a lot. That was just a lot of time spent on that idea. Whoo boy, I have a talent for just talking, don't I? I just cut the recording, and that last recording was 2 hours long. Some of its silences are going to be edited out while I was looking at pages or whatever, but fuck. It's almost like I've been running a Let's Play channel for 9 years. It might have a certain proficiency for just fucking talking forever. I don't know. I always feel bad about these things, but then everyone's like, no, that's why we're here. We're fucking used to it. We would have left by now if we didn't like this. This is not the go-to if you're one of those people that's like Googling a Witcher review that's expecting scripting and editing and conciseness. It's like, no, this is for when somebody wants to hear somebody fucking, it's just some lo-fi nerd rant about it for 3 hours, apparently. Well, we're ready to go to episode 4 now. 3. Only that far deep. Some of these are gonna be lightning rounds a little bit, though. I don't have a lot to say about some of these. So episode 3 is Betrayer Moon. Some of the things that I've said about Ciri and Yennefer have already happened at this point, because I kind of went ahead with both of their storylines so we could focus on Geralt a bit more, because Geralt's episodic, but Yennefer and Ciri kind of aren't. They're kind of just a continuous storyline. So Betrayer Moon is the Striga storyline, which is actually the first Witcher story. You open up The Last Wish, and you open up to the first story, and I was gonna say you get the voice of reason, but no, you get a story called The Witcher. So it's even named The Witcher because it's the story that introduces you to The Witcher. That's what episode 3 of the show is. That's where you fight the Striga, and that was my example I mentioned earlier about how like the book just starts. Like he's using his potions, he's using his powers, he's fighting monsters, engaging in with politics with groups and so on, and doing all these really specific things, and you kind of have to just roll with it, and you're kind of learning as you go what all this stuff means and why it's happening this way, which like I said before, I dig. This one does in episode 3. It's largely fine. The Striga story's not I don't remember it being massively complicated. It is the intro chapter of all of the Witcher's books in the first place. So generally speaking, there's not a ton to cover. So this one doesn't suffer as much from being abridged the way that the other storyline was. Because the other storyline, not only does it have like what might be the highest density of Yennefer interference of all back in episode 2, but also had to introduce Dandelion. Whereas this one, I think Dandelion might not have even been in this episode at all. And also, this is not as difficult to abridge of an episode in general. And there might be less, the Yennefer storyline might have taken up less of the overall duration in episode 3 than 4. But basically, the Striga is this horrible creature that has an entire castle all to its own, on like the edge of like a town or something, and people just guard the boundary and don't let anyone in because they will die. Because the Striga is just this horrible monster, and apparently sometimes it goes out and hunts people in the middle of the night and gets them, and then goes back to its lair. So it's a problem. There's like a vampire werewolf monster in this castle that no one can deal with, and it's been there for seemingly over a decade, I guess. Turns out it's a curse. It was King Foltest, I think in this case. King Foltest was sleeping with his sister, but her sister also had another lover, and that lover tried to curse one of them. It might have even been the King Foltest, but it ultimately resulted in, I think, the mother dying, and the woman and the daughter that woman was pregnant with became the Striga. In this case, I think the curse killed the mother, and then the Striga was this unborn baby that like clawed out of her body, basically, because that's in general, childbirth is a scary thing in the Witcher universe. There's a lot of different versions of the scary bad things. There's demon babies clawing out of the corpses of their mothers. There's abortions that turn into monsters and so on. That one shows up in Witcher 3. But in this case, the most of the storyline is Geralt going back and forth and kind of realizing exactly who the Striga is, what the curse is, who made the curse, and so on. So it's like he was just hired to kill this thing, but there's people who don't want him to kill it, and he's like, that's interesting. But then he keeps finding out why different people do and don't want the thing killed, and also he slowly unpacks the mystery of like that the Striga actually was the unborn baby of this person, and there was a curse made by that person, and untangles the whole political web where from the beginning to the end of the story, you have different ideas entirely of what the entire premise was. And that's most good Witcher storylines, is that you get a mission statement, or gets hired for something at the beginning, and then you find out layer upon layer of reason of like what actually is happening, and then the thing gets resolved usually. And it's a good first story for the Witcher in the books, because he's a monster slayer, he's a monster hunter, and he doesn't kill the monster, he cures the monster. And is just like, oh, okay. I'm curious to see what this Geralt guy's going to get up to over the course of the next, like, 800,000 pages of book. Because this is a good start. And there's probably differences between the show and the book, but they didn't stand out to me. Generally speaking, I'm like, this is fine. This is good enough. Sure. So, story 4 of Banquets, Bastards, and Burials. This actually might be one of my favorite episodes of The Witcher show. And it's also one of my favorite episodes of one of my favorite stories of these two books so far, which is, let's see, is it the Sword of Destiny, or is it a question of price? Because apparently it's saying that this episode adapts both of them, and I don't necessarily remember which one is which off the top of my head. Question of price. The Child of Surprise. Yeah. What is the Sword of Destiny? Oh, okay. That's what I thought. Okay, so yeah, I gotcha. So the Question of Prize is from the Last Wish book, whereas Sword of Destiny is from the Sword of Destiny book. It's the whole book is named after. So this is the episode that does double. So it focuses entirely on the Law of Surprise, both at the beginning and end points, kind of, but does it wrong, which is frustrating. I feel like this would have been better if they stuck to the original narrative of how Geralt meets Ciri, but because they didn't, it's kind of a mess. So what happens is that Geralt is invited to a party. I don't remember why he's at the party necessarily in the book, but in the show, it's because Jaskier might get murdered at this party because people are mad at him. So he's like, so Geralt, he pushes Geralt to be like, hey, you know how I've been helping you out with all those, you know, your reputation and your job and all that? If you could just do me a solid and like make sure I don't die tonight at this party, that'd be nice. And so that's the reason why Geralt's there in the show, at least. And it's just it's the the Queen of Sentra. I thought she was dead. And this is like one of those moments where you're realizing that Geralt's storyline takes place before Ciri's storyline, because you saw the Queen of Sentra die in Ciri's storyline, but here she is at this banquet, and she's with a girl who looks a lot like Ciri, but maybe a little older, but also definitely not the same actress or anything. And it's like, oh, this is a banquet about marrying off the Queen of Sentra's daughter. Gotcha. So that means she's going to eventually give birth to Ciri. So in the show, you have like foreshadowing elements here, which did not exist necessarily in the book, because in the book, Ciri didn't exist at all, because Ciri doesn't exist until she exists later when she's born. But you've been watching Ciri for 3 episodes now, so you're like, oh, Ciri, and that's her grandmother. So that must be her mother. Okay. And they just have this big banquet. All these different suitors are trying to claim the hand of this daughter of Sentra, and the Queen of Sentra in both the book and the show is a really good character that's well developed, and like she's kind of sassy and also like very sure of herself, and she's very politically minded and savvy and thoughtful and harsh, and a bunch of other details that just like make her fun to read and fun to watch in both versions. And she has her own ideas of what she wants to do with this political marriage and what would be best for the kingdom and so on. But then a weird masked character comes in, we got a guy wearing a helmet, and he claims the law of surprise because he apparently saved the Queen of Sentra's husband, the late king, and the king promised him the law of surprise. And the way that works is basically you're promising the reward in the form of what you have but don't know that you have yet. So you'll when you return home from war, I guess the idea is that life has changed in the meantime and things are different, and you're gonna find out that there's something you have that you didn't even know you had. And so that would be the thing that you then give to the person who saved your life, the law of surprise. So like you're pledging away a thing that you don't even know what it is yet. An unfortunate, often, like it seems everyone seems surprised when this happens, but it seems like almost one of the most inevitable outcomes is that this tends to be babies. It often tends to be like, oh, you got your wife pregnant before you left for war, and now there's a child waiting for you when you got back, because your war campaign was like years. So that child's now being promised away. And in this case, that's exactly what happened, is that this masked character is claiming the daughter because of the law of surprise, because that was what the reveal was, is that their daughter was born in that time and so when he came back, when the king came back, the daughter was the surprise, and so that's what this guy owns. Which, a few things going on here, which by the way, I think both in the show and the book, I think the Queen of Sentra herself comments on how fucked up this is. In general, considering how women are treated in these stories, it is kind of refreshing, for one, just to have a queen that is just ruling on her own, and she makes her own choices and all that, and she gets to comment on the world around her a bit, because the world around her is very not fair. And one of the ways that manifests is like this law of surprise is like it's dudes promising away unborn babies. So one, you're taking away the agency of that person, but also like you're taking the agency from their own mother. Like their own mother didn't get to be involved in the choice to have their child be promised away, but they have to respect this law of surprise, and that's like deeply fucked up for a number of reasons. And so that's so she doesn't have a lot of respect for this idea in, I think, both the show and the book. She's very not fond of the idea of actually respecting the law of surprise. Also, there's like a fucked up age gap here, because like the guy was already of fighting age and an adult, before this person was even born, due to the basic of how the law of surprise even works. So like, wow, there's a huge age gap between the guy claiming the law of surprise and the woman, in this case, that's becoming claimed as the law of surprise and all that. They at least conveniently waited so far into the future that like she's of like legal age and all that. So it's just like a creepy age difference, not like a really bad problem age difference in the other way, because she's an adult now at least, or something approximating one in this medieval setting, as opposed to being like an 8-year-old or whatever, or a 2-year-old. Because the other detail is that he's in love with her. It's like he's in love with his own pledged law of surprise baby. So it's like, it's rather fortunate that it's like he's not showing up until this child's like marrying day banquet and so on, instead of like way sooner. Otherwise this would be a way creepier storyline, but it's still pretty on the edge. But basically it's revealed that not only is there this whole law of surprise, but the daughter also loves him back and so on, and this is what they want. And the Queen of Sentra is fighting this, and it becomes apparently a detail that like destiny is a physical force in this universe, because fighting against the law of surprise has physical ramifications in that like this giant explosion of spell starts happening around them. They're like in this tornado. There's like a storm happening inside the building and stuff like that, and pushing everyone back because they're defying these two people's destinies and so on, which is interesting. And also like in the show, I think they might have ramped it up a bit more, partly because they're leaning so heavy on Destiny all season long that this was like the moment to really show how important Destiny is supposed to have. So the queen refuses the law of surprise, and this happens, and then explosion of force, and it's like everyone has to respect this. This is clearly a real thing, and so everybody gives in. And also the masked guy was a hedgehog. He had a hedgehog like head with a little funny nose and spikes on his head and everything, which is kind of funny. And I guess the queen giving her blessing for their marriage then lifts his curse and so on. And that character is going to be important later for a number of reasons. But everyone's like, "Oh, thank you, Geralt, for resolving this problem. What could I possibly what could I ever repay you?" is what the hedgehog says basically. And Geralt like doesn't really want anything, but then when he keeps demanding them, he's like, "Okay, fine. What about the law of surprise?" And he says it like in a joking way, because he doesn't really mean to get anything out of this. He just wants to move on with his life, and these people insist on rewarding him for the situation when he really wants to move on. So he's like, whatever, the law of surprise. Because the law of surprise supposedly usually just results in like a trinket or something, like some random item, not a baby. But lo and behold, it results in a baby again, because immediately like the law of surprise. And then they reveal that the girl that was just pledged away for law of surprise in the first place, she's already pregnant. And the Hedgehog Knight didn't know that yet. So that means their baby is the surprise baby again. So a person just got pledged to Geralt, which will later be a Ciri. That's a lot of that's roughly 1-to-1 with the book. I'm pretty happy with both the book and the movie versions of it. What I'm less happy about is that this is the same episode where Ciri just goes into the woods. It's just the episode where they go into the woods or they leave the woods or whatever, but like the Ciri in the woods storyline is handled here, and it might have been more meaningful if they wanted to do both storylines at once. It might have been more meaningful if they showed Geralt saving Ciri from the woods in the same episode where Ciri was pledged to him in the past. Like doing the future and past storylines in the same episode might have been more meaningful, but instead, because like those two have connection to each other. There's the story where Ciri becomes bound to Geralt, and then the story where Geralt actually follows up on finding Ciri and taking her into his care. So like you could bind those two stories together. The problem is they decided not to do the second one at all. Not just in this episode, but they just deleted the entire storyline where Geralt goes into the woods to save her from this like magic indoctrination group thing. And instead she just leaves of her own free will, which kind of undercuts the parallels there, but they still made them parallels by having them in the same episode. So it's like, if on paper, if you were reading like, oh, this one's based on the question of price and Sword of Destiny. Oh, I see what they're doing with that episode. And you'd be very shocked to find out that they completely changed what Sword of Destiny is. Like, they did the Last Wish in this chapter. So there's 2 books, The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, and they're both named after a short story in each book called The Last Wish and the Sword of Destiny. Each of them has like 7 short stories-ish per book, but in each of those books, there is specifically the one short story that the book is named after. The Last Wish happens in this season pretty much as intended, but the Sword of Destiny just doesn't happen. Like, this episode says it's an adaptation of Sword of Destiny from Sword of Destiny in the credit, but it's just not. Like, there just are the dryads, which I guess that's the idea, is they're dryads, not elves. So that's maybe why they shot the elf earlier, but I thought they were, I made the mistake of thinking they were elves, perhaps. I think that's the mistake I made earlier. But, like, everything that happens in the actual Sword of Destiny short story just doesn't happen in the show. Instead, they take to just saying the phrase Sword of Destiny over and over again. They start talking about an actual Sword of Destiny that falls one way or the other. There's 2 edges to the Sword of Destiny is what they keep saying. And I guess like they hope like the lip service to the title of the book will be enough. But it's like, I don't know. I can't help but feel like if a story is so important that he named the entire book after it, that not telling that story in your show is kind of a mistake. Because like, Last Wish is when, it's actually really specific, like Last Wish is when Yennefer and Geralt connect, and Sword of Destiny is when Ciri and Geralt connect. Like, it's really specific. Like, those are the 2 of the most important characters, and that's how they're introduced to Geralt's life. And one of them they tell, and the other one they don't tell, but they called the episode, they named the episode after that idea, or not, they adapted it, but not like that, not in the way that it makes it meaningful enough that it would be named what the whole book's named after. I don't know. I found that odd. Episode 5, Bottled Appetites. This one is an adaptation of The Last Wish. So back to back, we have Sword of Destiny and The Last Wish being adapted in this series in a reverse order, which is slightly weird, because The Last Wish came out first and chronologically happens sooner than Sword of Destiny in the books. But like I said, Sword of Destiny isn't really actually adapted in the show. They just kind of do some of the things, but not in the way that it would be meaningful to Geralt anyway. But so I guess it doesn't really matter. They're out of order. The Last Wish is when we start to let the story breathe a little bit better. Like the first story, like season 1, I mean, not season 1, episode 1 kind of had some breathing room because there weren't as many characters. And Bottled Appetites kind of gets back to that because Yennefer no longer is taking up a chunk of the story anymore for her doing her own thing, because suddenly Yennefer's story is in Geralt's story, because this is The Last Wish, the story where Geralt meets Yennefer for the first time in the books. So aside from a brief aside with Ciri in the episode to eat up a little bit of time, mostly you get the entire hour just with Geralt and Yennefer doing the Last Wish storyline. And it's pretty, yeah, I don't really have complaints about this one. This was good. This was an all right time. It starts with, I have one complaint. I just remembered. It starts with Geralt frantically fishing in a river for this, he's frantically fishing in the river for this genie lamp, basically. And he eventually finds it, but Jaskier is like kind of taunting him while this is happening, and he doesn't believe in genies and all that. And also he's like kind of just generally ribbing Geralt, and Geralt snaps at him and mentions that like he can't sleep. Like something's wrong with Geralt here. He looks frantic, and he almost looks like a cornered animal. Like he looks dangerous and vulnerable, and it's a unusual look from Geralt. And it sets up a really interesting thing where I'm looking forward to like seeing an episode or even episodes of Geralt dealing with whatever's going on with him as he gets maybe increasingly erratic and out of control. And as far as I can remember, it never comes up again. I think that's it. Like, that's my criticism of the episode, is that like I think they set up like an unhinged Geralt, and then he never is like that again. it might be because just like his sense of duty overtakes him or whatever. We'll get to that, but I don't know. It seemed iffy. But so they find the lamp, and immediately Jaskier just starts making wishes, and they're really self-serving, selfish wishes, and they're also like really wasteful. Like he's just saying things that come to the top of his mind, and he immediately says two things, and then his throat is attacked, and now it's a concern. It's like, oh no, Jaskier, he can't speak, and how is he ever going to sing again? His throat is his career, and also, is he going to die in the long term? Maybe. So that's concerning. So now Geralt's got to get him to anyone who can heal this magical wound. So like on some level, I could accept the idea like maybe Geralt's sense of duty to his friend overrode his exhaustion and his vulnerability and whatever was wrong with him at the beginning of the episode. But I think it was mostly just a clumsy attempt to set up the fact that, like, I guess as the season goes on, I think Geralt might be weighing on him, the fact that he's supposed to be going for Ciri, and it's supposed to be like he might be getting called to Ciri by destiny, and his refusal of that's making him frantic. But even then, I'm like, I don't know. It's been like, by the time that storyline happens, isn't she like 10 years old or something? Like, is that really a momentary thing that's going to happen to him, or is he been struggling for years at this? It's hard to say because you can't tell how much time is jumping. This is why it's always iffy whenever this season tries to do stuff that's like overarching storylines, is that it's hard to tell how to interpret it, partly because you can't even really tell how much time's happening between storylines, which is part of why like the book versions of these stories don't really have those kinds of through lines. But maybe it's the pledging of Ciri that's why it's happening, because the question of price, the one where the Child of Surprise happens, was last episode, so maybe they're trying to build on that, even though we don't really know when it is right now. Because like even Jaskier was like, wow, Geralt, I haven't seen you in years at the beginning of this episode, so like time has passed. It's the question of price. But apparently Geralt can't sleep, I guess, and it never comes up again. I think, I could be wrong, but I think it never comes up again. So in the book, when Jaskier's throat gets attacked, I think the assumption, which I don't, maybe isn't said in the show, but I think it's said in the book, the assumption is that the genie wants to go free and doesn't want to be in it doesn't want to be captive anymore. So it attacked him before he could make his third wish, the last wish, because then he can roam free in the world and be free of this. If his master dies before the last wish, or just can't make the wish, then there he goes. And so they go seeking magical healing, and they're trying to get Yennefer to help them, and mixed results there. But one of the culminations here is that it ends up with the Witcher, Geralt being in a cell when there's a person that's attacking him. And he's just like, I wish you would just fucking... He's like, any last words, Witcher? And he's like, I wish you would just fucking burst. And then he bursts. The guy explodes. And is very dead. And here's the moment where you realize, oh, Jaskier's wishes weren't happening. Geralt's the one making the wishes. And so he's the one who has the last wish. Because earlier, when he asked for just a moment of peace... And that's what led to Jaskier's being attacked. It wasn't the genie that did it of his own free will. It was that Geralt's wish was interpreted as an attack on Jaskier, and that's why he was attacked in the first place. So it's Geralt's fault that Jaskier is mortally wounded right now, and it's Geralt's fault that this one guy just exploded, although no one really cares about that guy. So he's the one that has the last wish. At this point in... as far as I'm aware, the book and the show largely line up until now, and I don't remember if this part lined up necessarily. But in the show, Yennefer kidnaps Jaskier because her plan is to use Jaskier, the power of Jaskier's last wish, to sort of absorb the genie's power, and she thinks that she might be able to use that in order to fix her uterus problem. Which is a problem when, Jaskier doesn't have the last wish. In particular, I think I think the idea is that she puts runes on herself that's gonna make her body the new home of the genie or something, and so the genie is gonna be forced into her when the last wishes happens. But then when she summons the genie, it starts attacking her, and Jaskier tries to make wishes and they don't work because he never had the wishes in the first place. It was always Geralt. So she's being like torn apart. But Geralt comes in and he makes a wish, and then the situation is resolved, but not to her liking because she doesn't get the power, but it does stop her from dying at least, and it resolves the last wish. The genie's gone, all that. In both the book and the show, you don't know what the wish was. He just whispers something in the show on camera, and you don't know what it is. And there have been fan theories for decades about what the fuck the wish is, because all we know is that it somehow makes the genie go away. Everyone survives the situation, but now Yennefer and Geralt are bound to each other and love each other forever. So that's just that's a thing to unpack. But now they have to love each other forever, and they can't stop loving each other, and so that's just kind of going forward from here on out. So good luck interpreting whatever the wish was. People have a few ideas, but there's like articles you can read about it, but no one actually knows for 100% sure. I think there's been one or two theories that the author has like outright said are wrong, but he's never said any of them are right. And I feel like he kind of just wanted to make it do whatever he wanted it to do, but didn't actually necessarily know what to say to make that wish happen. So he just left it ambiguous and just made it a magic wand that does everything he wants it to do, essentially, to bind these characters together, I guess. But yeah, this is largely vaguely equivalent to the books, and I don't really have much to say about this. But next up is 2 of the worst episodes of the season. This is the longest fucking podcast I've ever made. Why do I do this? It's also not the longest podcast I've ever made. So next up is Rare Species, and I'm kind of mad about this episode. In general, yeah. Also, I'm going to mispronounce this guy's name a lot, but it's the villain Trettenmirth. Villain Trettenmirth. Yeah. It's the villain Trettenmirth episode, the Golden Dragon, which I don't remember if he was referred to in Witcher 3 necessarily, but when we were playing Thronebreaker on this channel, that's what Ike kept referring to, or Ek. The honorable knight on the horse and all that. He referred to like a past incident where he got his ass kicked by villain Trettenmirth, the dragon, in the past. Villain Trettenmirth, I guess minor spoilers for Thronebreaker, but it's really hard to call it a spoiler. It's like an Easter egg, really, that's implied based on how it's a spoiler about the framing device of Thronebreaker, is the reveal that Thronebreaker's entire story, the narrator, was villain Trettenmirth, the dragon, who's also known as like Three Jackdaws, I think. He has like a nickname because he can disguise himself as a person. So the entirety of what Thronebreaker was told from his perspective. It was him kind of recounting the legend of, the stuff that happened in the game. And so that's what... So like that character's interesting enough and significant enough that CD Projekt Red decided to make him the narrator for an entire game they made. That's how interesting and important villain Trettenmirth is supposed to be. And this book, this show doesn't really do that much service, I would say. So right off the bat, we're off on a good start. We have Geralt and we have Jaskier and we have Yennefer in a story together. So once again, they're all in the same storyline together, so the story is going to get more time to breathe, and it's not going to be so truncated between two different points of views like the season was until last episode. So that's a good start. But yeah, we'll get to this. So it starts with villain Trettenmirth in the form of three jackdaws meeting Geralt. Three jackdaws is trying to hire him to go hunt this dragon that's that everyone's going after. There's a big king's party going after it, and Yennefer, at first Geralt doesn't want to do it, but then he sees Yennefer walk in, and she's part of the crew of another one of the crews that's going after the dragons. So he's like, okay, sure. Because until then he was like, I don't hunt dragons, they're intelligent and also wildly dangerous and a bunch of other problems. But because dragons are sentient, he doesn't want to kill them because they're both rare and they're intelligent, which, as we said before, are two of his characteristics. The don't kill rules. This is really underdeveloped, but let's see. Jackdaws is like this short old man, and he's got two tall women that are guarding him. And when people are like, why are you hanging around with this guy? How much is he paying you? And he's like, no amount of money would be. No, we do not accept money. That does not corrupt our behaviors or whatever. And they're like, what? Then why are you with this guy? He's just like, because he's beautiful. He's the most beautiful. Like that. Like they're being cagey with this idea. Like they're really into three jackdaws, even though that seems like they shouldn't be by most outside eyes, or at least especially by Jaskier's perspective. He's just kind of confused by this, but it's like it's kind of setting up the twist. Woo. All these different parties of people all go up the mountain to reach the dragon, and it's a difficult trek. And some of them are betraying each other, and some of them have friction with each other. And there's the knight that wants a title. There's the king that's orchestrating all this, is on the trip itself. There's a group of like dwarven mercenaries. There's another creepy group of like, I think there might be Skelliger raiders or something like that, or like other dangerous people that are less likely to cooperate with everything. Yennefer's there. Geralt's there with three jackdaws. They're all going to go hunt this dragon. And like this group or that group tries to take a shortcut to get there before the other group, and other stuff's happening, and various betrayals happen along the way in both versions of the narrative. A weird choice is made in the show, which is that Ike, I'm bad at this name. I should just get this name right so that I can stop going over it. Hey, and Vela, Bra, Crave. There's so many names to scroll through here. Ike of Denel. Yeah. Ike of Denel. EYCK is his name. He's the guy that was riding on horseback and had a lance in a Thronebreaker, which is about to become a problem because he dies in this episode, and he's not supposed to die in this episode. A random rare creature that looks like a starving bear shows up, and Ike chops it up and then keeps chopping like way too far. He kind of comes across as a dumbass all episode, and like he's high on his own fumes, and he's really cocky and insufferable. And then he gets killed off camera, shitting himself. Like he ate something bad and he was shitting himself, and then he's found dead. And that character just comes and goes so quickly that you're like, I don't even know why they even included that character in this episode. Like, why did they establish him if they weren't even going to do anything with him? Is it once again just another case of like, well, he's in the source material, so he's got to be there, just like the satyr, what are they called, Sylvan, that was throwing the metal balls? Like, is it another case of just insisting that we have to include the character that was in the source material even if we don't do anything with them? Because that seems to be what they did with Ike, is that they just kill him off and then move on, and he doesn't matter anymore. But anyway, when they reach the actual dragon, there's some interesting reveals. Oh yeah, I should mention that along the way, 3 jackdaws falls off a cliff, and so do his guards, and you never see them again for a while. And they're like, oh no, they're dead. You meet up with the dragon. You reach the dragon's den, and there's a reveal of like, oh, the dragon everyone came here to hunt is already dead. There's just this big dead dragon in the cave, but there's a gold dragon here. Where the fuck did this gold dragon come from? And earlier in the story, 3 jackdaws was mentioned gold dragons, and Geralt was like, gold dragons don't exist, they're a myth. It's like they're so rare that even the Witcher that always knows about creatures that other people think are myths and he knows they're real, even he thinks a gold dragon isn't real. So that's interesting. Because there he is. There's one right there. It's real. But then there's also the detail of like, if there was ever any gold dragons, they went the way of all the other dragons and have likely died anyway. And Three Jackdaws says something along the lines of like, there's more than one way to survive and stuff like that. So here's the gold dragon, and there's a small difference in the book. There's also a newborn dragon that's not old enough to fly, and so it can't leave this cave. And so now you know why the dragons were sticking around in this cave this whole time, because normally the dragons flee from humans. So if they knew that humans were coming, they would just take off, and so the humans wouldn't be able to hunt them this way. But they're staying at this cave, and this in the show's case, it's because there's an egg, and and apparently moving the egg would kill the life inside of it somehow, which is, usually eggs are better than that, but okay. It's probably just a budgetary constraint, so you don't have to animate another dragon. But in the book, there's just a young dragon that's too young to fly, so it has to be raised in this cave for a bit before it can move on. So this is like the moment of vulnerability in every dragon's life, essentially. This dragon is telepathic and is communicating with all the people that are here to kill it. The gold dragon is the adult, and so the king's sitting there in his mobile party, and he's like kind of conversing with all these different factions that have been hired to compete for accomplishing this goal. And like, you know, whoever accomplishes this, like, they're gonna get like a title, and they're gonna get all of this the dragon's hoard that's inevitably in the cave and so on. So like there's rewards here, and so people want these rewards. And so different groups are sabotaging each other's attempts to go after the dragon, and also engaging in different failed attempts to go after the dragon. Like Ike in particular has this really humorous thing where he and the dragon converse, and they agree on an honorable duel. So no magic and no flying and no dragon breath. It's just a battle of brawn. The two of them are going to go at each other. It's just going to be Ike on his horse with his lance, and the dragon being a dragon. What a stupid idea. Ike gets destroyed. In one swoop, the dragon just knocks the horse and Ike away, and Ike suffers some spine damage, and it's just like, he's out. As far as I'm aware, he survives. I don't know if he comes up again in the books ever again, but in Thronebreaker, he's still alive and kicking and doing things, because he's a party member in Thronebreaker. But Ike is out, and all of his bluster about honor and so on has been leading up to just an embarrassing defeat. And a series of things different happened. It's a relatively complicated sequence of events, and eventually, amusingly, the king decides, boy, this isn't even worth the effort. And the king leaves, and he just calls off the entire reward and the promise of like land or title or whatever he was promising, and he just fucking leaves. He's like, whatever, because like this is all a political gambit for him. He was going to use the defeat of this dragon as like a thing to increase his influence and help him get like some throne or a marriage or whatever the fuck he's going, political reasons. And he just leaves. And so everybody that was there just for the reward from him also leaves, and so on. But like, I think one of the other pirate groups or whatever, I think it's the Crinfrid Reavers, they stick it around because, whatever, the dragon has a hoard of gold in there, right? So we'll hunt the dragon. We don't need the king's reward. So like there's a whole evolving thing here, right? Like I'm not going to perfectly summarize every detail of it, but like there's a story being told here. So in the show, they get to the dragon's den. I'm actually not quite ready to say that yet. But after this whole scenario is resolved in the book, there is eventually the reveal that like you find out much later that villain Trettenmirth, the gold dragon that was there, was actually he was actually Three Jackdaws all along. So Three Jackdaws is alive, and he was actually a dragon the whole time, and like that was the twist in the story of the book. In the show, they arrive at the den, and it's, first of all, they took a shortcut. So like when they were arriving there, it's just Yennefer, and then shortly thereafter Geralt and I think Jaskier got left behind. And the two guards of Jackdaws both come out, and they're like, "What? How are you here? I thought you died." And then you see villain Trettenmirth come down, and he's this giant golden dragon, and He just fucking shows up and he immediately explains who he is, which like because they showed these two guards, they just immediately like gave away that Villain Trettenmirth was 3 jackdaws. It's not like an end of the story reveal that he was him the whole time. The moment you see Villain Trettenmirth, they immediately explain that he was 3 jackdaws the entire time. And then he awkwardly uses his telepathy to like exposit the entire situation of like how he specifically brought the Witcher along because he's the one person that won't kill dragons, and this was his plan all along, and it is me, three jackdaws, this was my scheme, and all the plot twist is explained in really overt terms. And then everybody else shows up, and then just a generic battle scene happens where everybody is defeated that was there to kill to kill the dragon. So like, much like the Sylvan episode, the entire scenario is wrapped up in like minutes, and it's like, oh, I was looking forward to the story happening, where like there's all these different factions that are competing for their different interests, and each one different it reacts to different things in different ways, and like, and the king leaves, which that changes the motivation of certain characters, and there's also like the comical defeat of Ike, and all these different elements that'll happen just don't happen in the show. Like, oh, okay, cool. There's a part in the book where they tie up Yennefer and she has to cast spells with her feet. She has to draw runes with her feet in order to do things because she's tied up, and she only has the slightest bit of access. I think it was specifically Yennefer and Geralt are both tied up, and Geralt uses the Igni sign to burn her bonds. But he warns her like she's gonna end up burning him. He's gonna end up burning her. But she's like, it's the only way we're getting out of this. So like she burns her leg and the bonds in order to get her free. And then she uses her burned foot to like draw these runes in the ground in order to cast these spells and stuff like that. And it's like, this is interesting. And it's also like, it complements. I almost feel like they cut this and they meant to include it, because like earlier in the season when they're showing Yennefer getting her transformation, she specifically doesn't use the anesthetic, so she's in horrible pain the whole time. So she's weirdly willing to go through great pain in order to get what she wants in a lot of these situations, and that's reinforced here when she is willing to be burned in order to defeat these people. And just none of this happens at all in the show. Instead, they just arrive on the location. The dragon just exposits the entire plot twist in a few seconds, and then a generic fight happens where none of the factions matter because just a bunch of dudes run in and they all get beaten up by Yennefer and Geralt and Villain Trettenmirth, who himself just uses fire. So you're kind of wondering why he couldn't just do this himself. Like, why did he need help in the first place if he could just burn all of them down? And like the whole fight's over in a couple minutes, and the king was never there in the first place, so there is no leader to the group. It's just a bunch of individual bands that were all hired on this expedition. And it's just like, it's just so, when you're expecting like interesting stuff to happen, this is so uninteresting. The most interesting thing is just the reveal that 3 jackdaws was a dragon, but it's the fact that it's just explained outright by the dragon, and it's not any kind of interesting realization by Geralt given away by any kind of clue or anything, is really boring. But also the fact that like, I think 3 jackdaws is wearing an entire shirt made of golden scales, and then he keeps dropping hints about golden dragons and how there's other ways to survive, and his 2 guards are like, he's the most beautiful and stuff like that. Like, I feel like there's so many hints that he's the gold dragon that it's maybe that a lot of the audience might already have figured it out before you even have him awkwardly explain the twist to you by just narrating it. And it's like, this was an interesting and kind of amusing and fun extended story with a bunch of twists and turns, and that went a bunch of different directions in the book. And in the show, it's just it's like, what? Dragons, I'm the dragon, big fight, the end. It's like, how? It's to the point where I have trouble thinking about how this took an hour, because these are hour-long episodes, and I have trouble thinking about like, how was that an hour-long episode? Because like, it didn't feel like an hour of story. Like I've watched some pretty well-paced shows that can do a relatively complex story over the course of an hour of TV. And I'll remind you, all these episodes are a full hour. They're not 40 minutes. They're not the 42-minute hour that daytime television has that is commercials, is these are hour-long episodes. Some of them are longer than hour long. And like, this was just, I don't know. It's like it's token gestures towards the idea. But like, I keep talking to people about the show and everyone seems to like it. So maybe if you don't know about the missed opportunity, maybe you still enjoy it. But I feel like the story is still really abrupt and clumsy and not particularly interesting. So I feel like it might still be, I feel like people watching it without the context might still have a sense that something's wrong with like the way it's edited or the way that it's presented. Like if there's something, like it feels like it's too, like things are resolved too quickly and too forced. Speaking of forced, this episode ends with the lowest point of the season where everyone's really sad and angry at each other. Boo hoo, hoo hoo hoo. Where Geralt and Yennefer are mad at each other, and Jaskier and Geralt's mad at Jaskier, and finally like gets him to fuck off, and like everyone's at their like the party is at the emotional lowest point, which is awkward because narratively, like I get what they're doing. We're about to have the penultimate episode of the season, so it's time to be all dramatic about like these people's feelings, and like this is when emotions would be frayed in the narrative. But nothing about this dragon quest really had anything to do with the party. So them being at each other's throats isn't really informed by the dragon quest itself. At most, it's just the fact that Yennefer keeps trying to find solutions for her infertility. And so last time it was the genie, and now it's the dragon egg. It was supposed to be the idea. So I guess there's that. So I guess she fails. So she is angry. So she and Geralt go at each other, and like she kind of highlights the fact that like there's like she can't differentiate whether she loves Geralt or whether it's just the curse. They're kind of on edge about that, but like just narratively, the fact that the episode wasn't about building up this conflict at all, and also these characters only met last episode for the first time, makes it really feel forced that they suddenly have this weird lowest point at the end of the episode where they're all mad at each other and so on. I'm not that surprised that Geralt's mad at Jaskier, because he's always mad at Jaskier in this version of the show. I guess this might be another version of like last episode started with Geralt being all crazy eye and like haggard. So maybe this is the next version of that, is now his crazy eyes and haggard is him like culminating in like wanting to get rid of Jaskier or something. But like, it's just the fact that like you finish the dragon storyline and then it just switches gears to like, and now the party of people that barely have interacted are all mad at each other, and this is the low point of the season and they all part ways, is like, huh? And it's also not entirely meaningful to have these characters part ways in an emotional conflict when like they haven't been together all season. Like Jaskier and Geralt have been around for a few episodes now, but like Yennefer and Geralt met last episode for the first time, and they mostly met at the end of the episode too, so it's like we don't really get a sense that these two have like much of a thing necessarily. It's one thing when it's the books, because they're a bunch of standalone stories that aren't connected, but when you're trying to make a show that has a through line with the emotions that a season of television tends to have, it feels really weird and forced, and like which is why these kinds of things didn't happen in those stories. They might happen later in the more continuous stories that I need to get to, but like, yeah, it just feels all out of place and weird here, and I just don't really approve of that. So for me, this was like a low point of the season, is these two episodes, because Rare Species was a really not great version of the villain Trettenmirth story, but also it ends on such a weird, awkward, forced moment, and so I didn't know what to think about that. I don't know. It was weird. Meanwhile, Ciri's just kind of off in the woods having adventures where people are trying to capture her, and she keeps getting away and so on, so it's not very interesting either. But then comes the worst episode of the entire season, which is Before the Fall. And this is one I talked about before, but this is the penultimate episode of the season, so it's time for the big climax. And it's just the fall of Cintra again, that we've already seen. So you get to watch like the queen die again and follow the window, but then it's smash cut and when she fell out the window and died on the floor there, Geralt was hiding behind a cart right there and saw it happen. Wow. That's worth showing for some reason. I'm glad we're watching the whole fall of Sentra again so that you can thread Geralt throughout the events, but he doesn't influence any of the events. at most, that charitably, the best I can think of is the fact that like the Child of Surprise episode was about how destiny is mandatory essentially, and if you defy destiny, bad things happen. So I think by having Geralt show up and ask to take Ciri away, and they refuse to let him have Ciri, the idea here is that by refusing to give him Ciri, they basically made the fall of Sentra happen, I think is what they're implying here by doing this. And so like that, I think that's that's best I can think of. That's like the reason why they're showing Geralt throughout this episode as being like retconned into the... It feels like retconning too. It really does. Like, it's weird. Like, this is the same season, so it was all made at the same time-ish. So it's not really a retcon necessarily, not in the normal sense. But it totally feels like one of those things that happens when a fantasy show runs for a while, or a sci-fi show runs for a while, and like 3 seasons later you show like a flashback where it shows what another character was doing during a major event that you guys saw seasons ago, and they're kind of retconning certain elements of that thing by showing what that guy was doing during that thing, and it changes your perspective on stuff. It's like that, but it's happening in the same season, so it feels really weird because it's like, oh, here's what Geralt was doing during the fall of Sentra, that thing that happened this season. I don't know why we didn't just show you this then. And this really just highlights my thing I said before, which is that I really feel like the fall of Sentra should just not be in the first episode. Just let us meet the Queen of Sentra during the episode where the Child of Surprise thing happens, and then reinforce her a few times, like sometime between, because like the Child of Surprise thing was episode 4. This is episode 7, so you have 2 episodes in between. You're already spending time on Ciri anyway, doing her stupid runaway storyline that keeps happening. I really feel like in this time you could show Ciri's mom give birth to Ciri, or not necessarily show the birth, but like you could just show like, oh, here's Ciri, and someone like just show, you know, that she has a baby, and then just show those scenes of like Ciri interacting with the townspeople and interacting with her parents, or her like maybe show something about like what happened to her mom, because her mom's out of the picture for whatever reason, but I think I know why. Show Ciri interacting with her uncle and her grandmother like she does in the first episode. Just show those in episode 6 and 7, like instead of this bullshit that's happening with her in the real show we got. Like, you could show those scenes over the course of those other episodes so that you build up the idea of like, oh, those characters from those characters we met in episode 4 for the first time, they're interesting. Look at them raising Ciri. This is nice. Oh, they got a little rapport. This seems nice. And then in episode 7, you have your big climax of like, oh god, he took an arrow to the eye in that one battle, and you have that really cool scene where the Queen of Sentra screams over over her husband's body with the arrow sticking out of his eye, and goes charging at that one person that did it, and like all these other things that happen. Like, I'm just thinking of like, what if all those seasons happened? What if all those really climactic scenes that happened in the first episode happened at the end of the season when we know these characters better and care about them more? Like, it would have been a better climax, wouldn't it? If we saw like her running through the battlefield screaming at that archer that took out her husband, and like, and her saying her final words to Ciri and falling out the window. Like, all these things are like more climactic for a number of reasons. Like, 1, because we know the characters better, and 2, because now we know that they're defying we know that they're in active defiance of the Child of the Law of Surprise, and they've brought this doom upon themselves apparently. And Geralt's like there throughout it, here and there, and like he can't do anything about it, and like all these things are happening that they're kind of bringing themselves upon themselves. So like, we better understand that, and like having this all happen in the climax would just be more meaningful, because then it feels like the entire scene was building up to this. The whole season was building up to this episode. We've introduced a bunch of concepts like the Law of Surprise and the Sentra Kingdom and the invading Nilfgaard army and a bunch of other things are all building up to this climax, and it all feels like a culmination of something. But they tried to have their cake and eat it too, because they fucking bust their nut in the first episode and show all this stuff then, and then they just show it again, and at the end, and so we're watching it again, and I'm like, sure, you did technically build up to this, and this is kind of a culmination of all the different elements you've established all season, but like, we've already seen this, so what the fuck? Why am I watching a clip show right now? It's like, I don't know why I have no idea why they framed the whole season this way. I'm so confused. But then we get something really interesting. So we end the season on a high note. So we're going to end this podcast on a high note. And yeah, like overall, I'm a little more positive than I am negative. I'm pretty mixed and frustrated with the season, especially the 3 bad episodes I've mentioned. But this final episode's pretty fun. So what happens in the final episode is the Sentra has fallen, everyone's thrown to the winds, and they also completely sidestep Ciri and Geralt for the most part this episode. Geralt at the beginning of the episode gets mortally wounded by, I don't know, neckers or whatever. It's one of the corpse eating monster-y things. There's a lot of those. And so he gets bit, and so he's kind of out of it the entire episode. So some nice guy is just carrying him in a cart as like a thank you for saving him and all that. It's the chapter Something More from The Sword of Destiny. And as far as I remember, a lot of this more or less happens it's close enough to what happened in the show. I mean, in the book, is that he's wounded, he's carried around, he has a bunch of like hallucinations about things that are all kind of expository about Geralt as a character. And here's the big difference of what they did, is that because the book is so committed to Geralt's perspective, we find out that there was this huge war, this big conflict at Sodden Hill. It's this place where all of the wizards came together to all band together to fight Nilfgaard in a final defiance against their evil and their conquering and so on. And they failed. And it's powerful in the books. Geralt looks at this obelisk and he's reading these names, and it shows the list of names of all these different people who fell in the battle of all these mages. It's just like, oh, that's a bummer. Like all those mages died defying the evil Nilfgaardian Empire. You don't get to see a battle, but it's powerful in its own way of like establishing how dangerous Nilfgaard is and what the cost is to what it's doing by just showing this list of powerful, trained people who all gave their lives trying to resist them here and failed. But being a TV show that's not based on Geralt's perspective, we get to spend an entire episode watching a mage battle, which is pretty fun. So these mages are at this location and they're just fighting the invading Nilfgaardian army, and it's actually a pretty cool thing overall. And I just had fun with this episode, so it's a decent final big hurrah for the show. It's also like maybe a point in the credit of the writers is the fact that this episode is entirely made up. As far as I'm aware, I don't think any of this is ever detailed in the books, as far as I'm aware, yet. So this whole Battle of Sodden is them just making up a conflict featuring all of the mage characters they've established this season, including Triss and Yennefer and the witch that trains Yennefer and some of the other characters. And also the one evil Nilfgaardian witch they've established since the beginning of the season. She's the one that's leading the other side of this conflict, and like you get to see a bunch of cool magic things happening. You get to see how evil the Nilfgaardian Empire is, because they will have these witches cast such expensive spells that like they just dissolve into dust because they just have spent themselves, which on one hand is kind of effective storytelling because it shows how ruthless Nilfgaard is, that they can just throw mages away to fire one fireball. But at the same time, like a witch dies to cast a fireball onto this catapult that they shoot at the base, and then people on Yennefer's side just deflect it and it goes flying harmlessly in a different direction. And then they do it again, and you're like, I feel bad for the first witch, but I feel especially bad for the second witch that just turned into dust so they could fail to hit them with another fireball. Like, that seems douchey, but credit to them. I guess they just wordlessly follow orders and die because they believe in the white flame, and they're all religious zealots, I guess, so they're just happy to sacrifice themselves. Similarly, there's another guy who like does his own form of like suicide bombing, where he like, there's a lot of suicide bombing actually, but this one guy like flies through the woods expelling mist everywhere to cover the approach of the soldiers, and then right as he gets to the front door of the of Sodden, he just collapses into a cloud and ceases to exist, but this item he was carrying drops on the ground, and that item releases mind control worms that lead to a bunch of people doing suicide bombing all over the entire base, which pretty much makes the entire place fall and causes the end of the conflict. Is that these mind control worms make all these, like, it makes one of the witches try to murder Yennefer, and it makes a bunch of kids like pick up like explosive bottles and throw them at other explosive bottles to just like explode entire areas of the encampment and so on. But like, yeah, that one guy he just died. Like, he just came in as a mist and then just died so that this thing can happen. He's like the guy in like he's like that one orc in Helm's Deep that dives into the wall to blow it up, and he's like, oh damn, that orc really believed in his goal. Like, he was willing to die for this purpose apparently. Like, in my head, I'm always like, oh, it's one thing to be willing to die and that you're willing to fight and you might get killed when you're fighting, but it's a whole other thing when someone's so willing to die that they're just like, they just fucking blow themselves up in these storylines. You're like, oh shit, I guess you got a true believer there. But at the same time, I find myself questioning the logic here, because I'm like famously there was always that intro cutscene for Witcher 3 where Yennefer casts a big spell and there's like a giant ring of dead grass around here because she sucked all the living essence out of the world around her to cast that spell. And we set up before the flower that they used to levitate the rock, and the flower would die in their hand because they're using that energy. I don't know why these wizards have to die to cast a fireball that isn't even effective, by the way. Like, so once you get past the idea of like, wow, Nilfgaard's so ruthless, they're so brutal, they'll just sacrifice their mages to cast a spell, Nilfgaard kind of starts to feel stupid, because like, they'll die to cast the spell, but like, even if you don't give a shit about them on like an individual basis because you're such a shitty, evil group of people or whatever, like, those mages take a lifetime to train. They're a huge resource-intensive thing that's very rare and you need to keep a hold of in order to do these really cool, powerful things. Why are you just throwing them away to accomplish basically nothing? Like, this is idiotic, as far as I can tell. And also, like, the game, like, the show has established these rules kind of about spellcasting, but not well enough. So, like, why can't they just, like, bring a cow? Like, or any livestock, like a sheep or a cow, or even the horses that are around. Like, they have horses. Wouldn't you, like, sap the living essence from the horse to cast a fireball? Does it have to come from yourself? Like, because they never established the idea that they can't cast it using outside influence, even though every other spell can seemingly be cast by outside energy. It just feels like they're being stupid and suicidal for no reason, even though they only have so many mages, so they shouldn't want to, like, just throw them away to cast one fireball. You would think that they'd have, like, anything else to draw the power from, so they don't just die to cast a fireball that then gets deflected and then do it again after that. Like, I don't know. I don't think that's very... It doesn't seem very smart. It makes Nilfgaard and the witch that's ruling that particular attack just seem like jackasses that don't value their own resources, even though that's how you lose a war, is by recklessly throwing away all of your valuable resources. Like, I know that, like, Nilfgaard's like a fucking force of nature. They're like global warming, or like they're like the whites from the White Walkers from Game of Thrones. Like, they're this giant unstoppable force that basically doesn't even have to be justified. It just will win, is basically how these books and the game and so on seem to kind of handle them. But, like, I don't know. It just seems like weird to be that stupid. But that was really the standout thing for me this episode, I think, was that the spell casting being weirdly self-destructive. Overall, I had fun with the mage battle. I had a good time. And it kind of felt like, because the show wasn't adapting a story, even though technically The Witcher being carted around in the B plot is technically an adaptation of something more from sort of Destiny. That was basically just an explanation of why Geralt's not in the episode, because Geralt kind of doesn't do anything this episode. Instead, it's just this big Yennefer and Triss war, and it's a fun thing to watch. And then, because they got to make it from scratch just for the show, they were able to pace it well and, like, plot it out. It didn't feel like it was edited like all fucky or having gaps of the story missing. It really highlights why sometimes the best way to adapt a universe is just to tell new stories in that universe that fit the medium you're using, instead of trying to tell the stories that were told in the book in your new medium that's not a book. Because like, you don't feel these weird adaptation problems from the game because the games make up new stories. But the show, like, everyone always talks about how like TV and shows are inherently different from books, and so like certain things will always change. And I pointed that as with some of the stuff about how like they insist on having through line characters that are in every episode, even if they shouldn't be, and so on. But like, if you were making a new story from scratch, you wouldn't have to deal with that. And I feel like one of the reasons why Much More is one of the best episodes of the season might be because of the fact that like it's not having to adapt anything. It just is. The only thing they're really adapting is the fact that Geralt found an obelisk in the books that lists all the people who died in this battle. They're just telling the battle from that story. So like, they're not really adapting anything. If anything, they're just making a sequel or a prequel to that story, kind of. And it's like the strongest episode of the season, basically. It's like the first episode and the Child of Surprise and this episode are probably the strongest episodes of the season. And it ends with Geralt and Ciri meeting each other, which was really weird. On one hand, like, them being like, oh my god, people who are bound by destiny will always find each other, and so on. Like, it was kind of a fitting end to the season to have them just encounter each other that way. The way they were always meant to be, and so on. And it's such a happenstance thing of like, oh, Geralt randomly getting bit was like destiny forcing him to meet up with Ciri because he got bit, and then a guy physically dragged him in a cart to where Ciri was by accident so they could meet finally. Like, the happenstance of that I appreciate, but it's really funny to me that like there's a thing where like so Ciri has to like, she wakes up in this house because she was also taken in by this family, because this family is just nice apparently and just takes people in. Ciri runs into the woods, and I get it because it's like Ciri's all like, I'm not gonna let other people get hurt for me anymore, because people that took her in kept getting hurt for it. So she runs into the woods to go fend for herself. So she's back where she started the season at, basically. But really what it feels like is like she had to run into the woods so the prophecy from the first episode would be true, because Renfrey said that the girl in the woods is your destiny. So it's really fucking awkward, because then what happens is Geralt gets carted out into the wood, into this house, and then they're like, oh, we found some girl, yeah, a little orphan girl, she was in the woods. And then Geralt just goes wide-eyed, girl in the woods, and then he just walks away. And it's funny because they never established that Ciri ran into the woods, so nobody knows that. Like, as far as I'm aware, nobody has noticed yet that Ciri has left her bedroom. So no one in that conversation says that she ran into the woods. But then Geralt just goes wide-eyes and walked into the woods and just walks directly to Ciri. And it's like, how did you know she was there? They were just talking about like how they just found a girl, and it's like she was staying in the house. So that was slightly weird. And it's also just funny to me because like, as a book reader, you're like, oh, the girl in the woods, yeah, because she's going to be with the dryads. But then no, it's those woods, which means that Ciri had to run into the woods before Geralt got there so the prophecy could be true. So it's like, it's up there with like when I hear about like people explain the plot of Kingdom Hearts and how like there's this one scene where there's like where Mickey is shirtless behind a door, but then there's a prequel that establishes why Mickey was there, and right before they get to that part, Mickey takes his shirt off because they have to make the continuity right about how in order for that story to make sense, he has to be behind a door with no shirt. So like when you make a prophecy about Ciri being in the woods, she has to go running out into the woods so that the prophecy could be true. And I'm like, I think the house is technically in the woods. She doesn't have to. All right, fine show. It's cool. It's fine. I just found it very silly. But no, the battle's fun. Overall, this, I don't know, fun idea for a show. Hope it improves over time. Hopefully when they run out of short stories, they'll be adapting a more long form story, and maybe it'll be more coherent, and maybe it'll feel less like they have to force too much plot into too little airtime, and also hopefully the characters will spend more time together so they don't have to do so many different perspectives, because they seem to struggle with that. And also hopefully they don't try any more non-linear storytelling with time where they like, where all the different plots are out of sync with each other, because I don't think they handled that as well. Like, I like the part where they respect the audience to understand that part, and I like the part where like, oh god, that character's supposed to be dead, but here they are, these must be out of sync. Like, a couple of those details are fun, but the overall, I think it weighed on the entire season in a negative way. And I hope they don't do that next season, please. And also don't show your climax twice in the same season, because that was weird. Anyway, see you guys next time. This has been my way too long rant about a show that I watched. That was like a third of the duration of the show.